Tonight, we're going to explore something that sits at the very edge of what we can know, at the boundary between magic and faith, between the seen and the unseen. We have journeyed together through fire and shadow, through questions of faith and power, through the stories of those who believed and those who doubted, through resurrections and sacrifices and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. It has been a long exploration, this contemplation of the God who brings back the dead, of the priests who served him, and the people whose lives were changed by encountering his power. You have stayed with me through all of it, through the complexity and the uncertainty, through the miracles and the horrors, and I am grateful for your companionship on this journey through the mysteries of R'hllor. If you found peace in this exploration, if these slow drifts through the lore of Westeros help you find rest at the end of your day, a like and subscribe would mean the world. It helps others discover these gentle journeys into the stories we love. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for sharing these quiet hours. In the far east of the known world, beyond the ruins of Valyria, beyond even the Summer Sea and the Jade Sea, there lies a city that exists more in rumour than in certainty. Ashy by the shadow, the Mesters call it, and even that name carries a kind of dread, a whisper of things that should perhaps remain unknown. It's a place where the buildings are made of black stone, oily and strange, where the river runs dark and thick, where no children are born and nothing grows. A city of shadow binders and sorcerers, of ancient knowledge and dangerous truths, and it is here, or perhaps even further into the Shadowlands beyond, that the worship of R'hllor is said to have begun. We don't know when this faith first emerged. The histories are unclear, fragmented, lost to the vast sweep of time. It was already ancient when Valyria was young, already established when the Andals first crossed the narrow sea. The Red Priests themselves speak of their god as eternal, as the first and the last, the light that existed before the world and will exist after it ends. Whether this is literal truth or theological poetry, we cannot say. The distance between Westeros and Asshai is not merely geographic, it is a distance of understanding, of certainty. We are dealing with mysteries here, and mysteries resist neat resolution. What we do know, or what we believe we know, is that the faith of R'hllor rests on a vision of the world as a battleground. Not a battleground in the sense of armies and steel, though those have their place, but a cosmic struggle between two fundamental forces, light and darkness. Fire and ice, life and death. On one side stands R'hllor, the Lord of Light, the god of flame and life and warmth. On the other stands his eternal enemy, a being so terrible that his followers will not even speak his name. The Great Other, they call him, or simply the darkness, the cold, the enemy of all that lives and breathes. This dualistic view of existence is central to everything that follows. The followers of R'hllor see all of reality as an expression of this conflict. Every fire lit against the dark is an act of worship. Every death is a victory for the enemy. Every sunrise is a renewal of R'hllor's promise. Every sunset a reminder of the eternal threat. It's a worldview that admits no neutrality, no middle ground. You're in the light or you're in the shadow. You serve the fire or you serve the cold. There is no third option, no space for doubt or ambiguity, though we will discover that the human beings who follow this faith are themselves full of doubts and ambiguities, as all humans are. The sacred flame is the visible manifestation of R'hllor's presence in the world. In the great red temples of the east, in Volantis and Myr and Lys and a dozen other cities, fires burn perpetually in honour of the god. These are not mere symbolic gestures. The flames are believed to be literally alive with divine presence, to be windows through which the god looks out upon the world and through which, if one has the skill and the faith, one might look back and glimpse what the god wishes to reveal. The priests and priestesses of R'hllor spend hours staring into these flames, searching for visions, for glimpses of what was, what is, and what might yet be. Volantis, the first daughter of Valyria, became the greatest stronghold of R'hllor's worship in the western reaches of Essos. The city's red temple is enormous, a structure that dominates the skyline, its central tower rising in honour of the flame that never dies. The temple can hold thousands of worshippers at once, and on holy nights it does, their voices rising in prayer as one. Quote, 0, they chant, and the words echo off stone walls made amber by firelight. It's a phrase that captures the essence of their faith, the acknowledgement that darkness and danger are real, omnipresent, and that only the light of a roller stands between humanity and utter annihilation. The red priests and priestesses who serve the Lord of Light are as varied as the cities they come from. Some are scholars, spending their lives in study of ancient prophecies and theological debates. Others are warriors, wielding blessed swords and calling down fire upon the enemies of their god. Still others are mystics, lost in visions, speaking in tongues, claiming to channel the very voice of R'hllor himself. They wear robes of red and orange and yellow, colours of flame, and many carry themselves with an absolute certainty that can be either inspiring or unsettling, depending on your perspective. These servants of the fire practice a faith that is both public and deeply personal. There are grand ceremonies, yes, with hundreds or thousands gathered to witness the lighting of sacred fires, the blessing of warriors, the proclamation of prophecies. But there is also the private devotion, the individual prayers offered at dawn and dusk, the quiet contemplation of flame in a darkened room, the whispered conversation between believer and God. The faith demands both communal expression and solitary seeking, both the voice raised in collective prayer and the silent watching of shadows dance in firelight. The worship of R'hllor spread slowly westward over centuries, carried by merchants and priests, by slaves who converted and freedmen who preached. It found fertile ground in some places and rocky soil in others. The free cities of Essos, with their cosmopolitan mix of peoples and beliefs, were generally receptive. A new god was just another option in the marketplace of faiths. But in Westeros, where the faith of the Seven dominated the south, and the old god still held the north, the Lord of Light was viewed with suspicion as something foreign and dangerous, a fire that might consume rather than illuminate. Yet the faith persisted, grew slowly, sent its tendrils across the narrow sea. Red priests appeared in King's Landing in Duskendale, even as far north as White Harbour, though never in great numbers. They were curiosities, mostly strange figures in their flame-coloured robes, preaching of prophecies that meant nothing to people whose concerns were more immediate, more tangible. Who cares about cosmic battles between light and darkness, when there are fields to plough, taxes to pay, lords to serve? The common folk of Westeros had their own gods, thank you very much, and saw no need for this eastern fire god with his talk of shadows and terrors. But the priests of R'hllor were patient. They spoke of a prophecy, ancient and terrible and wonderful all at once. They spoke of Azor Ahai, a hero from the depths of history who had once saved the world from darkness, and would, they claimed, come again. They spoke of the long night, a winter that had lasted a generation, when the very sun seemed to fail and things came from the far north that made brave men weep and warriors flee. They spoke of these things not as distant myths but as warnings. As previews of what was to come, the darkness would return, they said. The Great Other would send his servants once more, and only the Lord of Light, only R'hllor and his chosen champion could stand against the cold and the death and the endless night. Most people didn't listen. Most people had more immediate concerns, but some did listen. Some felt a resonance, a recognition, as if the words touched something deep and old and true. And in the fullness of time, in ways that none of them could have predicted, this strange Eastern faith would indeed find itself at the very centre of the greatest crisis the world had ever known. But that comes later. For now, in these early centuries, the faith was still finding its way, still learning how to speak to Western ears, still waiting for the moment when prophecy and reality would collide, and the world would learn whether the Red Priests were mad, or if they alone had seen the truth all along. The theology of R'hllor is not complex in its fundamentals, but it is deep, layered with meanings that reveal themselves only to those who study long and carefully. At its heart is that simple dualism we've already touched upon. There is R'hllor, who is light, warmth, life, growth, all things bright and good. And there is the Great Other, who is darkness, cold, death, decay, all things terrible and destructive. But this is not a balanced struggle between equal powers. The faith teaches that R'hllor will ultimately triumph, that light will overcome darkness, that the fire will burn away the shadow forever. It is a faith fundamentally oriented toward hope, toward an ultimate victory, even as it acknowledges the very real power of evil in the present moment. This eschatological dimension, this vision of a final triumph, centers on the figure of Azor Ahai. The legends say that 8,000 years ago, during the long night when darkness covered the earth, a hero arose. His name was Azor Ahai, and he was chosen by R'hllor to stand against the cold and the dark. To fight the enemy, he needed a weapon unlike any other, and so he set about forging a sword that would burn with the very light of the sun. This was Lightbringer, and its creation required terrible sacrifice. The story goes that Azor Ahai laboured for 30 days and 30 nights, forging a blade in sacred fires, but when he tempered it in water, the steel shattered. He began again, this time working for 50 days and 50 nights, pouring all his skill and devotion into the metal. When he tempered this second blade in the heart of a lion, again it shattered, unable to hold the power he sought to imbue it with, and so he began a third time, working for 100 days and 100 nights, and when the blade was ready he knew what the prophecy demanded. To create Lightbringer, the Red Sword of Heroes, he had to temper it in the heart of his beloved wife, Nissa. The sacrifice was made. Nissa's soul merged with the steel, and Lightbringer was born, a blade that burned with light and heat, that could cut through the darkness itself. With this sword, Azor Ahai drove back the forces of the Great Other, ended the long night, and saved the world. And then, his task complete, he passed from history into legend, and Lightbringer was lost. And the world moved on into ages that were troubled in their own ways, but not overshadowed by that absolute existential darkness. But the prophecy, as the Red Priests tell it, is not complete. Azor Ahai will return. When the stars bleed and the cold breath blows, when the darkness gathers once more, the prince that was promised will be reborn to fight the darkness again. This prophesied hero would be born of smoke and salt, would wake dragons from stone, would pull Lightbringer from the flames anew. The signs and portents surrounding this prophecy are many and often contradictory, which has led to endless debate among the priesthood about who this promised prince might be, when they might come, and how they would be recognised. Some theologians argue that Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised are the same figure, the same prophecy expressed in different words across different cultures and different ages. Others insist they are distinct. That multiple heroes are foretold, that R'hllor works through many champions rather than placing all hope in a single chosen one. Still others suggest that the prophecies are metaphorical, that Azor Ahai represents not a person, but a movement, a awakening, a collective rising of the light against the dark. These debates can grow heated, can lead to schisms within temples, can occupy the finest theological minds for entire lifetimes. The practice of the faith involves rituals that mark the passage of time and acknowledge the constant struggle between light and dark. Followers of R'hllor pray at sunrise and sunset, the liminal moments when light and darkness transition, when the boundary between day and night is most permeable. The prayers are formulaic, but meant to be spoken with genuine feeling, with true fear of the night, and true gratitude for the light. Quote 1. These words, repeated by thousands upon thousands of faithful across Essos and in scattered pockets beyond, become a kind of armour against fear, an assertion that someone, something, stands watch against the darkness. Fire is central to every ritual. The lighting of candles, the kindling of hearth fires, the great bonfires on holy days, All of these are acts of worship. Fire purifies, fire illuminates, fire keeps the shadows at bay. In the greatest ceremonies, huge effigies of wood and straw are constructed and set ablaze, the flames reaching high into the night sky, visible for miles around, a declaration that here, in this place, the Lord of Light is honoured. The darkness is defied. The people gather round these fires, feeling the heat on their faces, watching the sparks rise like prayers into the heavens, and they remember that they are not alone, that there is power in the light, that the cold can be held back if only the flame is tended carefully. But there is a darker side to the faith, one that troubles many, and has given Ahai's worship a sinister reputation in certain quarters. The Red Priests speak of sacrifice, of blood, of offerings to the Lord of Light. Not merely the sacrifice of animals or valuable goods, though those are made, but of human life itself. They speak of king's blood as particularly potent, as carrying within it a power that can fuel great magic, can turn the tide of battles, can reveal profound visions. And in the practice of the faith we find burnings, the immolation of heretics and criminals and sometimes innocent victims, offered to R'hllor in the belief that their deaths serve the greater cause of light over darkness. This aspect of the faith is controversial even among believers. Some Red Priests practice it with fervour, seeing in the screams of the burning a kind of terrible necessity, a price that must be paid to keep the world safe. Others are horrified by it, arguing that R'hllor is a god of life, not death, that sacrificing the living contradicts the very essence of what they claim to serve. The question of whether the god truly demands these sacrifices, or whether they are a human invention, a justification for cruelty wrapped in theological language, remains open, debated, unresolved. The visions in the flames are perhaps the most distinctive and mysterious aspect of R'hllor's worship. The Red Priests claim that by staring into fire, by opening themselves to the Lord of Light, they can see things hidden from normal sight. The past revealed in all its detail, the present in distant places, events unfolding hundreds or thousands of miles away, and most precious and dangerous of all, the future, or at least possible futures, threads of what might be woven through the flickering light and shadow. These visions are real. That much seems clear. Too many priests from too many places report seeing similar things, receive knowledge they could not have obtained through normal means, make predictions that come true in ways too specific to be mere chance. But the interpretation of visions is treacherous. Fire shows images, but it does not explain them. A Red Priest might see a man wreathed in smoke and assume one thing, when the truth is something else entirely. They might see a battle and believe they know the victor, only to discover that what they saw was metaphorical or inverted, or from an angle that disguised the true outcome. The faith teaches that R'hllor shows what he wishes to show, reveals what serves his purposes. The visions are gifts, yes, but they are also tests. Can the priest interpret correctly? Can they set aside their own desires and preconceptions to see truly what the flames reveal? The history of the faith is littered with priests who are certain, absolutely certain, that they understood what R'hllor was telling them, and who were proven catastrophically wrong. Certainty, it seems, is a danger in itself, a kind of blindness that comes from believing too strongly that one knows the mind of God. And this brings us to a fundamental question that sits at the heart of any exploration of R'hllor and his followers. Is the God real? Is there truly a conscious, intentional divine being who intervenes in the world, who grants visions, who empowers his priests to work miracles? Or is there simply magic in the world, raw and ancient and powerful, which humans have interpreted through the lens of religion, giving it a face and a name and a purpose because that is what humans do? We create narratives to explain what we do not understand. The faith offers no proof that would satisfy a skeptic. It offers experiences, visions, miracles perhaps. But these can all be explained in other ways if one is determined to explain them. And yet those who have encountered the faith directly, who have seen the things the Red Priests can do, often find themselves unable to dismiss it entirely, even if they do not fully believe. There is something there, some power, some force at work that defies easy categorization, whether it deserves the name Huller, whether it cares about humanity or operates according to some alien logic we cannot fathom. These questions remain tantalizingly open. As the faith spread westward, it evolved, adapted to new contexts, incorporated local elements while maintaining its core beliefs. The R'hllor worshipped in Volantis is not quite the same as the one invoked in Myr or Asshai. The emphasis shifts, the rituals acquire local flavour, the prophecies are interpreted through different cultural lenses. This is the nature of religion, to be both universal and particular, to claim eternal truth while existing in specific times and places with all their messy contingencies. And so by the time the faith of R'hllor becomes central to our story, by the time it arrives in force in Westeros and begins to shape the fate of kingdoms and the lives of our characters, it carries with it thousands of years of history, of theological development, of ritual practice, of prophetic tradition. It is ancient and new all at once, foreign and yet speaking to something that feels deeply familiar, the human need to find meaning in suffering, to believe that darkness is not the final word, that somewhere, somehow, light will prevail. Whether that belief is justified, whether the Lord of Light truly will deliver on his promises, we cannot yet say. But the flames continue to burn, the priests continue to pray, and the night remains dark and full of terrors, waiting for the dawn. The theology we've been exploring, the ancient traditions born in the shadow of Asshai, might seem abstract, distant from the lived reality of people going about their daily lives. But religion is never merely theoretical. It shapes how believers move through the world, how they understand their place in the grand scheme of things, what they're willing to sacrifice and what they hope to gain. So let us turn now to the practices, the rituals, the daily embodiment of faith in Orlor. Let us consider what it means, practically and spiritually, to serve the Lord of Light. The day of a devoted follower begins with prayer at dawn. This is not optional, not a casual gesture, but a sacred obligation. As the first light touches the horizon, as darkness begins its reluctant retreat, the faithful turn their faces eastward and speak the words that have been spoken for millennia. They acknowledge the return of the sun, thank R'hllor for bringing light once more to a world that might, without his intervention, remain forever in shadow. There is something profound in this daily recognition that light is not guaranteed, that each sunrise is a gift, a victory won again in the cosmic struggle between fire and ice. The evening prayer comes as the sun sets, as shadows lengthen, and the world prepares once more to face the terrors of darkness. This prayer is different in tone, more sombre, tinged with the awareness of vulnerability. For the night is dark and full of terrors. The phrase is repeated, sometimes dozens of times, a mantra against fear, a verbal talisman. The faithful light candles kindle fires in their hearths, create small circles of light against the encroaching dark. They are acting out in a miniature the great cosmic drama, pushing back the shadow through their own small efforts, aligning themselves with R'hllor's eternal work. Between these bookend prayers, the faithful are expected to live in a way that honours the Lord of Light. This means different things to different people, of course. The faith does not have a single codified set of commandments in the way that the faith of the Seven has its holy texts and clear moral prescriptions. Instead, R'hllor's followers are guided by principles, by an understanding that they are warriors in a cosmic war, that their choices matter not merely for their own souls, but for the fate of all existence. They are to choose life over death, light over darkness, warmth over cold in both literal and metaphorical senses. The Red Priests and Priestesses who dedicate their lives entirely to R'hllor's service live by stricter codes. They rise before dawn and sleep little, spending hours in prayer and meditation before the sacred flames. They study the ancient texts, though these are fewer and less systematic than one might expect. Much of the faith's wisdom is oral, passed from teacher to student, interpreted anew by each generation. The priests learn to read the flames, a skill that requires years of practice, a kind of patient attention that most people simply do not possess. They stare into fire until their eyes water and their vision blurs, searching for the images and meanings that Hala might choose to reveal. Not all who claim to see visions truly do. This is acknowledged even within the faith itself. There are charlatans, certainly, people who use the mystique of Rollo to gain power or wealth or influence. There are the self-deluded, who mistake their own imaginings for divine revelation. And there are the genuinely gifted, the handful who seem to truly touch something beyond themselves when they gaze into the flames. Distinguishing between these categories is one of the great challenges the faith faces. How do you know when a vision is real? How do you test prophecy without waiting for events to unfold, at which point it may be too late to act on the knowledge received? The faith has developed certain practices, certain rituals that are believed to enhance one's ability to receive true visions. Fasting is common, the idea being that an empty body creates space for the divine to enter. Sleep deprivation is sometimes employed, pushing the mind into altered states where the boundaries between the material world and the spiritual realm grow thin. Some priests drink bitter concoctions, herbs and compounds that induce trance-like states, though this practice is controversial even within the faith. Is the vision that comes from a drug-induced hallucination truly from R'hllor, or is it merely the mind playing tricks on itself? The prophecy of Azor Ahai is central to how the faithful understand their purpose in the world. They are not merely trying to live good lives or earn some pleasant afterlife, though those concerns exist. They are preparing for the return of darkness, watching for signs that the long night approaches once more, seeking the promised hero who will lead the fight against the great other. This gives the faith an urgency, a forward-looking intensity that can be both inspiring and exhausting. Every unusual event might be a sign. Every child born under strange circumstances might be the prince that was promised. The weight of prophecy presses down on the faithful, shaping their perception of everything that happens in the world. The specific signs that are to herald Azor Ahai's return have been debated and interpreted in countless ways over the centuries. The stars will bleed, some versions of the prophecy say, though what it means for stars to bleed is unclear. A bleeding star might be a comet, bright red in the sky. Or it might be metaphorical, representing noble houses falling, kings and queens dying, the established order collapsing. When a great red comet appeared in the sky in the year 299 after Aegon's conquest, red priests across the world proclaimed that the time was at hand, that Azor Ahai walked among them even now, though they could not agree on who that person might be. The prophecy speaks of the prince that was promised being born amidst smoke and salt. Again, the interpretations vary wildly. Some think this must be literal, a child born near the sea or in a fire. Others argue it's symbolic, that smoke represents struggle and salt represents tears or the sea or purification. The ambiguity is maddening to those who seek certainty, but it's also perhaps necessary. A prophecy that was too specific, too clear, would constrain R'hllor, would limit the god's ability to work through unexpected means. The vagueness allows for flexibility, for the divine plan to unfold in ways that surprise even the faithful. One of the most controversial aspects of the prophecy is the claim that Azor Ahai will wake dragons from stone. In the centuries after the doom of Valyria, dragons became increasingly rare, and after the death of the last Targaryen dragon around 153 years after the conquest, they were believed to be extinct. Dragon eggs turned to stone, became beautiful but lifeless artifacts, treasured for their historical significance but no longer capable of hatching. So what could it mean to wake dragons from stone? Was this purely metaphorical? Dragons representing power or wisdom or some quality rather than actual living beasts? Or was the prophecy suggesting something that seemed impossible, that true dragons might return to a world that had learned to live without them. The Red Priests did not abandon this part of the prophecy even when it seemed most implausible. They continued to teach it, to search for its meaning, to wait for the impossible to become possible. This is part of what separates faith from mere hope or wishful thinking. Faith persists even when circumstances make its claim seem absurd. Faith says that what appears impossible to human understanding might be simple for a god. The priests of R'hllor maintained that Azor Ahai would wake dragons from stone because R'hllor had shown them this in visions, and if reality seemed to contradict the vision, well, reality would have to change. The matter of Lightbringer, the legendary sword that Azor Ahai would wield, adds another layer of complexity. Some believe that the actual physical sword from the first long night still exists somewhere, waiting to be found and claimed. Others think that Azor Ahai reborn will have to forge Lightbringer anew, will have to make the same terrible sacrifice that the original hero made, tempering the blade in the heart of their beloved. This raises troubling questions. Would R'hllor truly demand such a sacrifice? Would a loving god require someone to murder their wife or husband to create a weapon? Or is this part of the prophecy also metaphorical? The sacrifice of love representing some other kind of loss, some other price that must be paid? The rituals surrounding death and what lies beyond occupy a significant place in the faith's practices. Unlike some religions that focus heavily on the afterlife, promising paradise to the faithful and punishment to the wicked, R'hllor's faith is more ambiguous about what happens after death. There is an acknowledgement that the Great Other claims the dead, that death itself is the enemy's domain. But whether this means eternal torment or simply cessation, whether the souls of the faithful are protected somehow or everyone faces the same darkness, the theology is surprisingly unclear on this point. What is clear is that the priests of R'hllor have developed practices related to death that set them apart from other faiths. When someone dies, the Red Priests sometimes perform rituals over the body, speaking prayers that are meant to guide the departed, or perhaps to prevent the Great Other from claiming them entirely. The words vary depending on the priest and the circumstances, but they usually involve fire, the lighting of candles around the corpse, sometimes the burning of the body itself to prevent it from being used by dark forces. There is a practical wisdom in this, even if one doesn't believe the theology. In a world where the dead sometimes rise and walk, burning bodies makes a certain sense. But there is one ritual, one prayer, that stands apart from all others, that represents the most audacious claim the faith makes. It is the ritual of resurrection, the prayer that asks R'hllor to return life to the dead. Not all priests know this prayer. It is not taught openly, not written in text that any novice might read. It is passed from master to chosen student, shared only with those who have proven their devotion and their capacity to bear the weight of such knowledge. And even among those who know the words, very few have ever attempted to use them. Because the faith teaches that resurrection is not given lightly, that R'hllor will answer such prayers only when it serves his purpose, when the person being called back has a role yet to play in the great struggle against darkness. The prayer itself is said to be simple, almost shockingly so given the magnitude of what it requests. The priest speaks to R'hllor, recounts the virtues or the importance of the deceased, asks that they be returned so they might continue to serve the light. The priest places their hands on the body, sometimes on the heart, sometimes on the head, and channels their own faith, their own life force into the dead flesh, and then they wait. Sometimes nothing happens. The body remains still and cold, and the priest must accept that R'hllor has chosen not to answer, that this death is final. But sometimes, rarely, miraculously, the body stirs, breath returns, eyes open, the dead live again. What comes back is a matter of some debate. The resurrected are not quite as they were. They are changed, marked by their passage through death and return. Their memories are often damaged, pieces of their past lost or confused. Their personalities may shift, become harder or stranger, as if the experience of dying has burned away parts of what made them human. Some claim that the resurrected are not truly the same person at all, that what returns is something else, perhaps a tool of R'hllor animated by divine will but lacking the soul that once inhabited that flesh. Others insist that the person is fully restored, that the changes are merely natural consequences of trauma, no different than how any profound suffering might change someone. The faith does not offer easy answers to these questions. The priests acknowledge that resurrection is a mystery, that even they do not fully understand what they are doing when they perform this rite. They are servants of R'hllor, instruments through which the god works, but they are not privy to all the god's purposes or methods. This humility, this admission of ignorance, even in the face of miracle, is perhaps one of the more admirable aspects of the faith. It would be easy to claim complete understanding, to pretend that performing resurrections makes one wise in all things. Instead, the faith maintains that these are moments when the divine breaks through into the world, when something beyond human comprehension occurs, and the appropriate response is awe and gratitude rather than pride. The sacrifices that the faith sometimes performs, the burnings that have given it such a dark reputation in many places, require careful consideration if we are to understand R'hllor's followers, rather than simply condemning them. The theology behind these acts is rooted in the belief that all life contains power, that the living carry within them a kind of fire, a spark that can be released through death and offered to R'hllor. This power can be used, the priests claim, to fuel great works, to turn the tide of battles, to see more clearly in the flames, to bring about the fulfillment of prophecy. King's blood is considered especially potent. Those descended from royalty, who carry in their veins the heritage of ancient lines, are believed to possess greater power than common folk. This is not meant as a judgment of worth, necessarily. The faith does not teach that kings are better people, or more deserving of love and dignity, but it does claim that their blood, specifically, contains magic that can be tapped for important purposes. This belief has led to some of the most troubling practices associated with R'hllor: the targeting of royal children, the burning of prisoners who happen to have royal ancestry, the willingness to sacrifice one life if it might save thousands. The faithful justify these acts in various ways. Some argue that death is coming for everyone anyway, that the great other will claim us all eventually, so using a death to serve R'hllor's purpose is simply directing an inevitable event toward good rather than evil. Others suggest that those who are sacrificed actually gain honour and meaning from their deaths, that instead of dying pointlessly from disease or age or random violence, they become part of something greater, their ending woven into the cosmic struggle between light and dark. Still others admit that the sacrifices are horrible but necessary, that war requires terrible choices, that squeamishness about such matters is a luxury the world cannot afford when darkness threatens to overwhelm everything. Not all followers of R'hllor agree with the practice of human sacrifice. There are priests who argue passionately that the Lord of Light would never demand such things, that these burnings are human inventions, cruelty masquerading as piety. They point to the core message of the faith, that R'hllor is a god of life, of warmth, of light, and ask how such a being could desire the screams of the burning, could want to see flesh char and bones blacken. These internal debates are fierce and unresolved, with different temples and different regions coming to different conclusions about what practices are acceptable. The faith's relationship with political power is complex and often troubling. Because the Red Priests claim to see the future, because they position themselves as interpreters of divine will, they can become powerful political actors. Kings and lords who convert to the faith or who simply want to use it for their own purposes may elevate Red Priests to positions of influence, giving them access to resources and authority that can be used in many ways. Some priests navigate these situations with integrity, trying genuinely to serve both their god and the people affected by their counsel. Others become drunk on temporal power, using their religious authority to pursue personal ambitions, becoming kingmakers and manipulators, prophets in name but politicians in practice. The challenge is that the priests genuinely do see things in the flames, or at least many of them do. They have access to information through magical means, and this makes them valuable advisors even to those who don't believe in our law. A skeptical king might not worship the fire god, but might still listen when a red priest reports seeing enemy troop movements in the flames, especially if such visions prove accurate. This creates a dynamic where the faith gains influence, not through conversion, but through utility, which raises its own questions about the nature of belief and power. The ceremonies that mark important moments in a follower's life take on distinctive character within Erhala's faith. Births are celebrated with fire, of course, the lighting of candles to welcome a new life into the world, prayers that the child will serve the light and resist the darkness. Names are sometimes given based on visions the priests have seen, prophecies about the child's destiny, though this practice is more common in Essos than in Westeros, where such things are viewed as presumptuous or even dangerous. Marriages in the faith are conducted before a sacred flame, the couple joining hands over fire, speaking vows that commit them not just to each other but to the service of Ahlor. The ceremony acknowledges that marriage is a union of two flames into one, creating more light together than either could produce alone. There is poetry in this, a genuine beauty to the metaphor, even if one doesn't believe in the theology behind it. The married couple are expected to support each other in faith, to pray together, to maintain the fire of their shared devotion. Death rites we have already touched upon, but they deserve a bit more attention. When a follower of R'hllor dies, the ideal is cremation, the body given to flame as a final gift to the god who gave life. The mourners gather around the pyre, speaking of the deceased's virtues, recounting how they served the light, expressing hope that R'hllor will welcome them. There is grief, certainly, for those who remain behind feel the loss. But there is also a kind of defiant celebration, an insistence that death is not the end of meaning, that the person's life mattered in the cosmic scheme, that their service to the light continues in ways that may not be visible but are nonetheless real. The faith's holy days are tied to solar cycles and to prophetic anniversaries. The summer and winter solstices are particularly important, the longest day and the longest night, moments when the balance between light and dark is most pronounced. On the summer solstice, there are festivals of light, huge bonfires, celebrations that last from dawn to dawn, as if by stretching the revelry through the entire cycle the faithful can somehow extend the light, hold back the inevitable return to shorter days. On the winter solstice the mood is more sombre, more defensive. The longest night is a time of vigil, of keeping watch, of ensuring that fires never go out, that darkness never fully triumphs even on the night when it is strongest. There are also holy days tied to prophetic events, though these vary between different sects and regions. Some temples celebrate the anniversary of a legendary moment when R'hllor is said to have intervened directly in history. Others mark the dates of famous visions or miracles. There is no central authority that mandates uniform observance, which leads to a certain creative diversity in how the faith is practiced. A red priest from Volantis visiting a temple in Myr might find the rituals slightly different, the emphasis shifted. The local flavour affecting how the universal truths of the faith are expressed. The question that haunts all of this, the question that thoughtful followers cannot help but ask eventually, is how one knows that any of it is real. The visions might be self-fulfilling prophecies, the mind seeing what it expects to see. The miracles might have natural explanations that we simply don't understand yet. The prophecies might be vague enough that they can be interpreted to fit almost any outcome. Even the resurrections, as astonishing as they are, might be magic rather than divine intervention, might be the priest's own power rather than R'hllor's answering hand. The faith's response to this doubt is interesting. Rather than insisting on absolute certainty, rather than claiming that doubt itself is sinful, many of the wisest red priests acknowledge that faith and doubt are not opposites, but companions. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the choice to believe and act despite doubt. The flames show what they show, and we interpret as best we can, but we might be wrong. The prophecies point towards something, but we might misunderstand. R'hllor might be real, or might be a name we give to forces we do not comprehend. But either way, the practical question remains the same. Will we serve the light or the darkness? Will we choose life or death? Will we resist the cold or surrender to it? In this framing, the existence of Orah'lla as a literal divine being almost becomes secondary to the ethical and existential choices the faith calls its followers to make. Whether the Lord of Light is a god or a metaphor, the long night was real, and it might come again. Whether Azor Ahai was a person or a symbol, the battle between life and death, warmth and cold, continues every day. The faith offers a framework for engaging with these realities, a way of understanding one's place in the struggle, a community of others who share the commitment to stand in the light rather than accept the darkness. And so the faithful pray their dawn prayers and their dusk prayers. They tend their fires and study their flames. They debate prophecy and interpret visions. They make the sacrifices they believe are necessary. Whether those are sacrifices of comfort and convenience or something far more terrible, they wait for Azor Ahai, scanning every unusual birth and auspicious sign, wondering if this might be the moment, if the darkness is even now gathering for its final assault. They are called fanatics by some, visionaries by others, but mostly they are people trying to make sense of a world that is dangerous and mysterious, reaching for meaning and purpose in the ancient words of a faith that promises, despite everything, that light will ultimately prevail. The theology and practice we've been exploring might seem far removed from the lived reality of Westeros, from the castles and keeps where the great houses play their game of thrones. The Red Priests were exotic curiosities in the Seven Kingdoms, their faith something strange and foreign, practiced by a handful of converts but largely ignored by the lords and ladies who shaped the realm's destiny. But there are moments in history when the exotic becomes central, when what was dismissed suddenly becomes crucial, when a drunk priest from across the sea finds himself at the very heart of events that will reshape the world. This is the story of one such man, Thoros of Myr, a red priest who lost his faith and found it again through the most shocking of means. Thoros was born in the free city of Myr, one of the great trading powers of Essos, a place where the faith of R'hllor had deep roots, but competed with many other beliefs in the cosmopolitan marketplace of religions. He was the youngest son in a large family, and as was sometimes the custom in such situations, he was sold to the Red Temple as a child. This was not necessarily cruelty, though it might sound like it to modern ears. Families without the means to support all their children might give one to the faith, where the child would be fed, educated, trained in a prestigious profession. It was opportunity wrapped in necessity, a common enough practice in cities where poverty and piety intersected in complex ways. The boy who would become Thoros showed aptitude for the priesthood, or at least enough aptitude that his teachers continued his training. He learned the prayers and the rituals. He studied the sacred texts such as they were. He spent hours staring into flames, trying to develop the sight, the ability to see visions in the fire. Whether he ever truly saw anything in those early years is unclear. Perhaps he reported seeing what he thought he was supposed to see, images that fit the expectations of his masters. Perhaps he saw nothing at all and simply went through the motions, doing what was required to advance in the hierarchy. Or perhaps he did have glimpses of something real, sparks of genuine vision that would lie dormant for years before manifesting fully. He was ordained as a red priest in his early 20s, taking the vows, committing himself to the service of R'hllor for the remainder of his life. The high priest of the Red Temple in Myr had a mission in mind for this young priest, something ambitious and perhaps foolhardy. The Seven Kingdoms of Westeros had been largely untouched by R'hllor's faith. A few red priests had visited, but none had made much headway in converting the population. The high priest decided to send Thoros across the narrow sea to the royal court in King's Landing, to preach the faith to King Aerys II Targaryen and his court, with the hope that if the king converted, the realm might follow. It was not an unreasonable plan in theory. Kings had converted to new faiths before, bringing their kingdoms with them. And Aerys was called the Mad King for good reason, but before his madness fully consumed him, he had been interested in magic, in fire, in old prophecies. A god of flame might appeal to a man who would eventually become obsessed with wildfire, who would dream of burning his enemies, who would see in fire both power and purification. But Thoros arrived in King's Landing around the year 270 after Aegon's conquest, when Aerys was already sliding into paranoia and cruelty, but not yet completely lost to madness. The mission was a failure from the start. Thoros preached, yes, performed the rituals, lit the sacred fires, spoke of the prophecies and the coming darkness, but Aerys was not interested, and neither was his court. The lords and ladies of Westeros had their own gods, thank you very much, and saw no need for this eastern fire worship. They found Thoros entertaining, perhaps a curiosity from across the sea, but not someone to be taken seriously. And Thoros, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated, increasingly disillusioned, increasingly aware that his mission was futile. So he did what many people do when faced with failure and purposelessness. He drank. Thoros discovered that he had a taste for wine, particularly the sweet wines of the Arbor, and that drinking made the disappointment of his failed mission more bearable. He began to attend feasts and tourneys, not as a priest seeking converts, but as a reveller seeking company and wine and distraction from his failing faith. He was a large man, jovial when drunk, capable of great humour and storytelling, and he found himself welcomed in certain circles not for his priesthood, but for his personality. He became known for a particular trick he performed in tournaments. Thoros would coat his sword in wildfire, that strange alchemical substance that the alchemist's guild produced, and then light it aflame. He would ride into the lists with this burning sword held high, a spectacular sight that thrilled crowds and terrified horses. It was showmanship, pure and simple, a parlour trick dressed up in the imagery of his faith. The flaming sword recalled Lightbringer from the prophecies, but Thoros was not Azor Ahai. He was just a priest who had lost his way, using the symbols of his religion for entertainment rather than devotion, and yet he kept the outward forms of the faith. He wore his red robes, though they became increasingly stained with wine and food. He maintained his shaved head in the style of the Red Priests. He performed the dawn and dusk prayers, though often while nursing a hangover. The words had become rote, emptied of meaning by repetition without belief. Thoros had not formally renounced his priesthood, but neither was he really practicing it. He had become a kind of ghost, going through the motions of a life he no longer believed in, stuck in a foreign land on a mission that had failed, unable or unwilling to return home in disgrace. This continued for years, more than 2 decades of slow dissolution, of faith eroding like a cliff face worn away by waves. Thoros fought in Robert's rebellion when it came, wielding his flaming sword at the Siege of Pike during the Greyjoy Rebellion, gaining a reputation as a capable warrior even if he was no longer a particularly devout priest. He was first through the breach at Pike, they said, his burning sword clearing the way for the men who followed. It was brave and reckless, and exactly the kind of thing a man does when he no longer fully values his own life, when he's looking for meaning in action because he can't find it in belief. After Robert Baratheon took the Iron Throne, Thoros remained at court, a fixture in King's Landing known to everyone, liked by many, taken seriously by no one. He drank with Robert, matched the King cup for cup, which was no small feat given Robert's legendary capacity for wine. He told stories of Myr and Essos, entertained noble children with tales of dragons and magic, performed his fire trick whenever someone had a wedding or a name day celebration, important enough to warrant such spectacle. He was a character, a personality, but he was not a priest in any meaningful sense. The fire had gone out of him even as he continued to play with literal flames. And then came the War of the 5 Kings, that great convulsion that tore the Seven Kingdoms apart after Robert's death. Thoros found himself, almost by accident, joining the brotherhood that Lord Beric Dondarrion was forming. Eddard Stark, serving as Hand of the King in Robert's absence, had sent Beric with 100 men to bring the king's justice to Gregor Clegane, who was raiding the Riverlands. Thoros went along, perhaps because he was bored, perhaps because he sensed that something important was happening, perhaps simply because he had nothing better to do. The life of a court drunk was wearing thin even for him. The mission went badly from the start. Beric's force was ambushed at the Mummers Ford. Many men died in the initial fighting. Lord Beric himself was struck down, killed by a lance through the chest, and the survivors scattered into the woods, hunted by Lannister men who had orders to kill anyone who stood against them. The remnants of Beric's company found themselves outlaws by necessity, hiding in the forests and hills of the Riverlands, trying to survive, trying to understand what had happened to the ordered world they had known. Thoros had seen death before, certainly. He had fought in battles, had killed men himself, had watched friends and companions fall. But there was something about Beric's death that struck him differently, that broke through the alcoholic fog he had been living in for so many years. Perhaps it was the senselessness of it. A good man struck down in the service of justice, killed by those who should have been punished. Perhaps it was simply that Thoros liked Beric, found in the young lord a kind of idealism that he himself had lost. Whatever the reason, when he looked at Beric's corpse, when he saw the young lord's chest still and his eyes empty, something in Thoros shifted. He did what he had been trained to do so many years ago, what he no longer believed would work. He performed the prayer for the dead, the words that ask R'hllor to restore life to those who have fallen. He had never attempted this before, never even believed it was really possible. It was just words, he thought, ritual and ceremony that had meaning only to those who had faith, which he no longer did. But he spoke them anyway, over Beric's body, his hands on the dead lord's chest, the words coming out rough and uncertain, more plea than prayer. He was saying goodbye, really, performing a last act of respect for a fallen friend, going through the motions one final time before abandoning even the pretense of priesthood. And Beric Dondarrion opened his eyes and gasped for breath and lived again. Imagine the shock of that moment. Imagine Thoros's absolute disbelief. He had not expected anything to happen. He had not believed R'hllor was real, had certainly not believed that the god would answer his prayer, that the words he had spoken in desperation would actually bring the dead back to life. But there was Beric, sitting up, touching the wound in his chest which had closed but left a terrible scar, looking around with confusion and wonder, asking what had happened, asking why he felt so strange. Thoros had no answers. He stammered something about R'hllor, about the Lord of Light bringing Beric back for a purpose, but he did not understand it any more than Beric did. All he knew was that he had spoken words he barely believed, and a dead man had returned to life. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. And in that moment, everything Thoros thought he knew about the world, about faith, about the existence or non-existence of gods, all of it was turned inside out and remade. The Brotherhood without banners, as they came to call themselves, became something more than a band of outlaws hiding from Lannister forces. With Beric alive again, impossibly alive, they had a mission, a sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. They began raiding Lannister supply lines, protecting small folk from the predations of both sides in the war, trying to maintain some small island of justice in a realm descending into chaos. And Thoros became Beric's closest companion. The priest who had brought him back, who alone seemed to have some connection to the power that had restored the Lord's life. But death, it turned out, was not so easily defeated. Beric had a quality about him now, a kind of fey otherworldliness, as if he was not entirely present, not entirely human anymore. And as the war ground on, as the Brotherhood fought and raided and tried to survive, Beric died again. He was killed by Lannister soldiers, run through with a sword, and the men carried his body to Thoros desperate, demanding that the priest do again what he had done before, and Thoros, still not fully understanding but willing to try, spoke the prayer once more. And once more Beric returned. This happened 6 times in total. 6 deaths and 6 resurrections, each one taking something from Beric Dondarrion, each one leaving him a little less than he had been. His memories began to fade. Pieces of his past dropping away like leaves falling from a tree. He forgot the names of his siblings, forgot what his castle looked like, forgot the songs his mother used to sing. His voice changed, became deeper, rougher, as if something in his throat had been burned away. He needed less food, less sleep, as if the normal requirements of human life were becoming optional for him. He was still Beric, still recognizable, still possessed of his sense of honor and justice. But he was also becoming something else, something that existed in the space between life and death. Thoros performed the resurrection ritual 6 times, and each time was harder than the last. The prayer that had come almost accidentally the first time became something he had to fight for, had to pour more of himself into. He would spend hours beforehand in meditation, staring into flames, trying to find the connection to R'hllor that would allow the miracle to happen again. He lost weight, became gaunt, as if each resurrection took something from him as well as from Beric. The other men in the Brotherhood watched this with a mixture of awe and horror, unsure whether what they were witnessing was a blessing or a curse. For Thoros, the resurrections transformed his understanding of faith entirely. He had spent 20 years and more as a priest without belief, going through the motions, speaking words that meant nothing to him. Now he believed, but his belief was complicated, not the simple certainty he had been taught as a child. He believed that R'hllor was real, or that something was real, some power that answered when he spoke the old words, some force that could return life to dead flesh. But he did not understand why. Why had the god ignored him for decades when he was faithfully performing his duties, only to answer him when his faith had nearly died? Why bring Beric back again and again when so many others died and stayed dead? What was the purpose of these resurrections? What role was Beric meant to play that required him to die, and return, die, and return, until he was more memory than man? Thoros asked these questions in his prayers, staring into the flames, searching for answers that rarely came. He received visions now. Images in the fire that he could not dismiss as imagination or wishful thinking. He saw things he could not possibly know through normal means, events happening far away, dangers approaching, paths the Brotherhood should take. The sight that had eluded him in his youth had come to him now in his middle age, now that he had lost his certainty and gained his doubt. The flames showed him things, but they did not explain them. R'hllor gave him power, but not understanding. He could work miracles, but could not say with confidence what the miracles meant. The relationship between Thoros and Beric became something unique, something that neither of them had words to fully describe. Thoros had brought Beric back, had given him life when death should have been final, and this created a bond between them that went beyond friendship or loyalty. Beric trusted Thoros completely, followed his counsel even when it seemed strange or contradictory, because Thoros was the connection to whatever force had restored him, and Thoros felt responsible for Beric in a way that went beyond normal duty, because he knew that each resurrection was taking something irreplaceable from the man, because he wondered if bringing Beric back again and again was truly mercy or a kind of slow torture. They rarely spoke of this directly. What words could capture such a relationship? Instead, they worked together, leading the Brotherhood, trying to maintain justice in the Riverlands, even as the war destroyed everything around them. They hanged men who preyed on the weak, regardless of which side those men served. They distributed food to starving villages. They protected travellers on the roads when they could. It was small, insufficient, a few drops of water trying to hold back a flood, but it was something, and perhaps that was what R'hllor wanted from them. Not grand destiny or world-changing heroism, but simply the persistent effort to choose life and justice when death and chaos seemed overwhelming. The other men in the Brotherhood looked to Thoros with a mixture of reverence and unease. He was no longer the drunk they might have dismissed or pitied. He was the priest who brought back the dead, who spoke with fire, who saw visions that guided their path. Some began to convert to the worship of R'hllor, adopting the prayers, seeking meaning in the Red God's faith. Others remained skeptical, believing that something uncanny was happening, but not ready to call it divine. Thoros did not push them either way. He had learned that faith cannot be forced, that belief comes in its own time or not at all, that what he had once thought was conviction had really been performance. And what he had dismissed as impossibility had turned out to be the truth. Thoros watched Beric diminish with each resurrection, watched the man he had brought back become less human and more purpose, less person and more symbol. It troubled him deeply, raised questions he could not answer. Was this what R'hllor wanted? To use people up in service to the light, to burn them away until nothing remained but the mission, the task, the endless fight against darkness? Was Beric better off dead, at peace, rather than trapped in this half-existence, dying and returning, losing pieces of himself each time, becoming a kind of living ghost who could not remember his own mother's face but remembered perfectly his oath to protect the innocent? And yet Thoros could not bring himself to stop. When Beric died, when the men brought his body to the priest, when they looked at him with hope and desperation and demanded that he perform the miracle again, how could he refuse? How could he say no, it is better to let him stay dead, when the Brotherhood needed their leader, when the small folk needed their protector, when perhaps R'hllor genuinely did have a purpose for Beric that required these continued returns? So Thoros would pray again, would speak the words that no longer felt like empty ritual, would feel the power flow through him into the corpse before him, would watch with relief and horror as Beric gasped and lived once more. The drunk priest who had lost his faith in the comfortable halls of King's Landing had become something he never imagined he could be. A true servant of R'hllor, perhaps, or at least someone through whom the god's power flowed. A worker of miracles who did not fully understand the miracles he worked. A man who had found belief not through study or revelation, but through the impossible made real, through speaking words he did not believe and having them answered anyway. Thoros of Myr, who had failed in his original mission to convert a kingdom, had succeeded in something stranger and more profound. He had learned that faith is not about certainty or understanding, but about standing witness to mystery, about saying the prayers even when you doubt, about asking for miracles you don't believe will come and then being utterly transformed when they do. If Thoros represents the humble, accidental servant of R'hllor, the priest who stumbled into faith through miracle and necessity, then Melisandre of Asshai stands at the opposite extreme. She's certainty where Thoros is doubt, purpose where he found confusion, absolute conviction where he learned humility. She is perhaps the most powerful practitioner of Ahala's magic that Westeros has ever seen, and also perhaps the most tragic because her certainty, her absolute belief that she understands the god's will, leads her to commit acts of terrible consequence, to make choices that will haunt her and others for the remainder of their days. We know very little about Melisandre's origins, and what little we know comes in fragments, hints, memories that she herself seems uncertain about. She's old, far older than she appears, though how old exactly is unclear. She speaks of Asshai by the Shadow as her home, that strange dark city at the edge of the known world, but whether she was born there or came there as a child is uncertain. There are suggestions buried in her own memories that she was once a slave, that she was bought as a child and brought to the Red Temples, that the name Melisandre is not the one she was born with, but one given to her by her masters or teachers. This possible history of slavery and transformation is significant if true. It would mean that Melisandre, like Thoros, was given to the faith rather than choosing it freely. But where Thoros responded to this with eventual rebellion and dissolution, Melisandre embraced it completely. made the faith so central to her identity that any earlier self was burned away entirely. She became Melisandre the Red Woman, the priestess of R'hllor, and whatever child she'd been before that transformation ceased to matter, or perhaps ceased to exist at all. She trained in the shadow arts, the mysterious practices that come from Asshai and the lands beyond, things that blend magic and religion in ways that make even other red priests uncomfortable. Shadow binding, the creation of living darkness that can be shaped and directed, the summoning of powers that have no clear place in the simple dualism of fire and ice that R'hllor's theology teaches. Melisandre mastered these arts, became proficient in them in ways that few others achieve, and she did so while maintaining that everything she does is in service to the Lord of Light. That shadow is just another tool that fire can use, that the end of defeating darkness justifies any means necessary. She does not age as normal humans do. The glamour she wears, the ruby choker that rests against her throat, keeps her appearing as a beautiful woman in the prime of life, red-haired and pale-skinned, with eyes that seem to glow in certain lights. But there are moments, rare glimpses, when the glamour falters, or when she removes it in privacy, and what is revealed is something far older, far stranger, a woman who has lived for centuries perhaps, who has seen ages come and go, who has studied her faith and her magic for longer than most people draw breath. This longevity is itself a mystery. Is it a gift from R'hllor, a reward for her devotion? Is it the result of her shadow magic, something she has achieved through means that have nothing to do with the god she claims to serve? Or is it something else entirely, a quality she possessed even before she came to the faith, a reason she was chosen or sold or brought to Asshai in the first place? She needs little sleep, little food, little of the ordinary comforts that sustain human life. She can go days without eating and show no sign of weakness. She does not feel cold as others do, can walk through winter storms in her thin red robes, can hold her hand in flame without flinching. These abilities set her apart, make her seem more than human, and she uses this perception deliberately. She's not trying to be relatable or accessible. She's positioning herself as a conduit of divine power. As someone who has transcended normal human limitation through service to R'hllor, and whether this is true or merely an act she performs, the effect is the same. People fear her and follow her in equal measure. Melisandre came to Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen fortress, sometime around the year 299 after Aegon's conquest, though she may have been in Westeros before that, watching, waiting, preparing. She attached herself to Stannis Baratheon, the dour and uncompromising lord who believed, not without reason, that the Iron Throne was rightfully his after his brother Robert's death. Stannis was not naturally inclined toward religion, had little patience for priests and prophecies, and the mystical claims of any faith. But Melisandre offered him something he desperately wanted: validation, prophecy, the promise that his claim was not merely legal but divinely ordained. She declared that Stannis was Azor Ahai reborn, the prince that was promised, the hero prophesied to save the world from the coming darkness. She had seen him in her flames, she said, wreathed in fire, pulling a burning sword from the flames, leading armies against the night. Everything in the ancient prophecies pointed to him. He was of royal blood. He had awoken on Dragonstone, the island fortress literally built of stone and surrounded by salt sea. The signs were clear to her, unmistakable, and she proclaimed them with absolute certainty, with a conviction that brooked no doubt or questioning. Not everyone in Stannis' household accepted this change. Maester Cresson, who had served House Baratheon for decades, who had helped raise Stannis from boyhood, was horrified by Melisandre's influence. He saw her as a foreign sorceress leading his lord astray, filling Stannis' head with prophecies and promises that could only end in disaster. The old Maester tried to kill Melisandre, attempting to poison her with the Strangler, a deadly toxin that kills within moments. He put the poison in a cup of wine and drank from it himself first to convince her it was safe. A sacrifice he was willing to make if it meant removing her influence from Stannis. Melisandre drank from the poisoned cup without hesitation, swallowing the wine that should have killed her, and she did not die. She did not even sicken. She smiled at Maester Cresson as he collapsed, as the poison he had taken worked its terrible effect on him while leaving her untouched, and she spoke words of regret for his death, but not of surprise. She knew what he had attempted, had seen it perhaps in her flames, and she had drunk anyway to prove that R'hllor protected her, that she was beyond the reach of mere human schemes. The demonstration was effective and chilling. If poison could not touch her, what could? The shadow she birthed beneath Storm's End remains one of the most disturbing and inexplicable acts of magic witnessed in the recent history of Westeros. Stannis' younger brother Renly had declared himself king and commanded the loyalty of the Stormlands, which by rights should have been Stannis'. The two brothers were preparing to meet in battle, and though Renly's forces vastly outnumbered Stannis', Melisandre told Stannis that numbers would not matter, that R'hllor would deliver his brother into his hands. She required only one thing from Stannis: his essence, his seed, his life force that she could shape into a weapon. What happened in the cave beneath Storm's End, the exact nature of the ritual, is known only to those who were present. Sir Davos Seaworth, Stannis' most loyal follower, rode Melisandre to the cave, witnessed at least part of what occurred, and what he saw haunted him for years after. Melisandre was with child, though she had not been pregnant before, a pregnancy that lasted hours rather than months. She gave birth to a shadow, a living darkness in the shape of Stannis, and this shadow slipped away into the night on some terrible errand. The next morning, Renly Baratheon was found dead in his tent, killed by what witnesses described as a shadow with Stannis' face, a darkness that passed through steel armour as if it were not there, that struck Renly down and vanished, leaving no trace except a corpse and a roomful of shocked, terrified witnesses. Melisandre birthed at least one more shadow, possibly two, assassins crafted from darkness and sent to kill Stannis' enemies. Each one required the same ritual, the same sacrifice from Stannis, and those close to him said that the shadow binding took something from him, left him weaker, more haggard, as if he was being consumed slowly from within. Melisandre herself discouraged further use of this power, saying that making more shadows might kill Stannis, might burn him up entirely, but she had used it when necessary, when the enemies were too strong to defeat by conventional means, when R'hllor's purpose required drastic action. The moral implications of these shadow assassinations troubled even some of Melisandre's followers. This was murder by sorcery, the killing of men who had committed no crime except to stand in Stannis' path to the throne. Renly, whatever his faults, was Stannis' own brother, and he died without warning, without chance to defend himself, killed by dark magic in the night. Was this the will of R'hllor, the god of a light and life? Or was this something else, something darker, Melisandre's shadow arts dressed up in the language of religious purpose? The questions were asked quietly, in private, because no one wanted to voice them openly where Melisandre might hear and take offence. But Melisandre's confidence never wavered. She had seen Stannis in her flames, seen him as Azor Ahai, and everything she did was in service to that vision, to ensuring that the prophesied hero could fulfill his destiny. If brothers had to die, if dark magic had to be employed, if loyal followers had to be sacrificed, well, these were small prices to pay for the salvation of the world. The Great Other was gathering his forces in the far north, she said. The Long Night was coming again. Only Stannis could stand against it, and only if she helped him, only if she was willing to do the terrible things that prophetic destiny required. The burning of sacrifices became a regular practice under Melisandre's influence. She claimed that king's blood held power, that sacrificing those with royal lineage would grant visions, would ensure victories, would appease R'hllor and secure his favour. When Stannis took Dragonstone, when he found Robert's bastard son Edric Storm sheltered there, Melisandre saw an opportunity. The boy had king's blood, was the son of Robert Baratheon, and his death would release tremendous power. She began to advocate for his sacrifice, to argue that burning the boy would be a small price to pay for the magical advantage it would grant. Davos Seaworth, who had been raised to lordship by Stannis despite his lowborn origins, who had followed his king through every challenge and disaster, could not stomach this. He helped Edric Storm escape, smuggle the boy away before Melisandre could burn him, and face Stannis' wrath for this betrayal of orders. But Davos argued that if winning required burning innocent children, then perhaps winning was not worth the cost, that there had to be limits even in pursuit of prophecy. Stannis, torn between his trust in Davos and his faith in Melisandre's visions, ultimately allowed the boy to live, but the incident revealed the deep tensions within his camp, the question of how much was too much, where the line should be drawn between necessary sacrifice and unconscionable atrocity. Melisandre's visions in the flames were real and often accurate, but her interpretation of them was flawed in ways she would not discover until it was too late. She saw a man in the flames, a figure surrounded by snow and ice, and she was certain this was Stannis at the wall, Stannis fighting the darkness in the far north. She saw snow and assumed it meant a location, a battlefield, when it might have meant something else entirely. She saw visions of a great battle and assumed she knew who would fight it and why, when the truth was more complex than her theological framework could accommodate. This is the tragedy of certainty, of believing so completely that you know the mind of God that you become unable to see evidence that contradicts your interpretation. Melisandre was powerful, genuinely in touch with magical forces that most people could not perceive, but she was not infallible, and her refusal to admit the possibility of error would lead to consequences that devastated everyone she sought to help. She could see the future in fragments, in images and symbols, but she could not fully understand what she saw, and her confidence that she did understand became its own kind of blindness. When Stannis' campaign in the south failed, when he was defeated at the Battle of the Blackwater and forced to retreat, Melisandre counselled that this was merely a setback, that R'hllor's plan was larger than any single battle. The true war was not for the Iron Throne, she said, but for the survival of all life against the darkness gathering in the north. The vision showed this clearly. The Night's Watch on the wall was under threat from wildlings, and worse, from the ancient enemy that R'hllor had been warning about for thousands of years. Stannis needed to go north, to claim his role as Azor Ahai by defending the realm against the real threat, and in doing so he would prove his worthiness for the throne, and win the loyalty of all Westeros. And so Stannis took his remaining forces and sailed for the wall, arriving just in time to break the wildling siege, to save the Night's Watch from being overrun. It was a glorious victory, a demonstration of the power he could wield when fighting in R'hllor's service, or so Melisandre claimed. She saw in this success the confirmation of everything she had prophesied, proof that Stannis was indeed the chosen one, that his destiny lay in the north, that all would unfold as R'hllor had revealed to her. But she also saw another figure at the wall, a man who confused her visions and complicated her certainties. Jon Snow, the bastard son of Eddard Stark, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. A young man who seemed to appear again and again in her flames when she asked R'hllor to show her Azor Ahai. She would pray for a glimpse of the prophesied hero and see only snow, which frustrated and puzzled her. Snow was a bastard, without royal blood or claim to anything, a boy who had given up any chance at power or dynasty by taking the black and joining the Night's Watch. How could he be Azor Ahai? It made no sense, contradicted everything she had proclaimed about Stannis, and so she dismissed it, assumed she was misinterpreting, that the visions were showing her someone at Stannis' side, an ally perhaps, but not the hero himself. The relationship between Melisandre and Jon Snow was complex from the start. Jon was wary of her, uncomfortable with her magic, sceptical of her prophecies. He had been raised in the faith of the old gods, had spent his entire life being taught that magic was rare and dangerous, that those who claimed to wield it were either frauds or threats. And yet he could not deny that Melisandre did wield real power, that her flames showed true visions, that her presence had helped Stannis arrive at the perfect moment to save the Watch. He respected her power even as he distrusted her certainty, and she found in him something that unsettled her. A quality she could not quite define, but which made her flames show his face when she sought the hero who would save the world. When Stannis marched south from the Wall to attempt to reclaim the north, to rally the northern houses to his cause and take Winterfell from the Boltons who had betrayed and murdered the Starks, Melisandre remained at Castle Black. She said she needed to stay, that R'hllor had shown her that her place was at the Wall near Jon Snow, though she could not say exactly why. This separation from Stannis would prove significant in ways neither of them could anticipate. Stannis marched into winter storms and military disaster, his army slowly destroyed by cold and hunger and desertion, his campaign failing despite all of Melisandre's promises that R'hllor would grant him victory. And at Castle Black, Melisandre's visions began to shift, to show her things that terrified her, because they suggested that everything she had believed, everything she had proclaimed for years, might be wrong. She saw darkness overwhelming the world. She saw the Night King and his army of the dead marching south. She saw fires extinguished and shadows triumphant. And when she looked in the flames for Azor Ahai, for the hero who would stand against this darkness, she did not see Stannis. She saw Jon Snow again and again, and she began to understand slowly, reluctantly, that perhaps the god had been trying to tell her something all along, something she'd refused to hear because it contradicted her certainties. When Jon Snow was assassinated by his own men, stabbed repeatedly by Night's Watch brothers who believed he had betrayed his vows, his body was brought to a chamber and laid out for burial. Melisandre looked upon the corpse and knew what she had to do, what R'hllor was demanding of her. She performed the resurrection ritual, the prayer that Thoros of Myr had stumbled upon years before, the words that asked the Lord of Light to return life to the dead. She had never attempted this before, had never needed to, and she was not certain it would work, not certain R'hllor would answer her any more than he seemed to have answered her prayers for Stannis' victory. She spoke the words, ancient High Valyrian phrases, and she washed Jon's wounds, and she cut his hair, and she performed all the ritual elements that the Red Priests teach, though she had never done them for this purpose. And then she waited, and nothing happened. Jon Snow remained dead, cold and still, and Melisandre left the room in despair, believing she had failed, that her faith had been misplaced, that perhaps R'hllor was not real after all, or did not care, or she had been wrong about everything for so very long. Melisandre lived for centuries seeking to serve R'hllor, studying the flames, growing in power and knowledge, becoming one of the most formidable practitioners of the Red Faith the world had ever known. But all her power, all her visions, all her certainty could not protect her from the fundamental error of believing she understood more than she did, of mistaking her interpretation for divine truth, of confusing her desires for the god's will. She was a tragic figure, not because she was evil, but because she was so absolutely devoted to good as she understood it, and that devotion led her to commit horrors that good itself would reject. The Red Woman of Asshai, the servant of R'hllor, the priestess who could see the future, could not see herself clearly, could not recognize her own capacity for terrible error until the consequences had already unfolded and there was nothing to be done but continue forward and hope that the god she served truly had a purpose for it all. The power that Melisandre wielded, the visions she saw, the magic she commanded, all of it pointed toward one particular claim that sets R'hllor's faith apart from almost every other religion in Westeros and beyond. The claim that death is not final, that the Lord of Light can and does bring back the dead, that under certain circumstances, with the right prayers and the right faith, a person who has crossed into the realm of shadow can be pulled back into the light. This is not resurrection as metaphor or spiritual concept, not the promise of some distant afterlife or reincarnation in ages yet to come. This is immediate, physical, undeniable return from death to life, and it has happened, by our count, at least 7 times that we know of in the recent history of Westeros. 6 times to one man and once to another, and the implications of these resurrections, the questions they raise, the price they exact, these deserve our careful, contemplative attention. Let us begin with Beric Dondarrion, the young lord who became the Lightning Lord, who died and returned so many times that he became more symbol than man, more purpose than person. The first death came at the Mummers Ford, as we have already touched upon, a lance through the chest from a Lannister soldier during an ambush that scattered Beric's company and left them outlaws in the Riverlands. Thoros of Myr spoke the prayer, not believing it would work, and Beric returned with a gasp and a shudder, his wound closed but scarred, his eyes opening to a world he had left moments before. What did Beric experience in those moments of death? He struggled to describe it, as if the memory was already fading even as he tried to grasp it. He spoke of cold, of darkness, of a sense of something vast and empty opening up before him. Then warmth, a pulling sensation, a voice calling him back though he could not say whose voice it was, and then consciousness returning like a flood, painful and disorienting, his body remembering how to breathe, his heart remembering how to beat. He was himself, but also not quite himself, as if some essential element had been left behind in that dark place, and what returned was not the complete person but a version, a copy that was close but not perfect. The second death came months later, in a skirmish with Lannister soldiers who were hunting the Brotherhood. Beric was run through with a sword, a mortal wound that punctured his lung and left him drowning in his own blood. Again his men brought his body to Thoros, demanded that the priest work his miracle once more. Thoros was reluctant, frightened by what he had done the first time, uncertain whether it was right to pull Beric back again, but the men insisted and Thoros prayed, and Beric returned once more. This time the recovery was harder, took longer, and when Beric could finally speak he said that he had forgotten something, could not quite remember what it was but felt the absence like a missing tooth, a gap where something had been. The third death was at the hands of the hound Sandor Clegane during a trial by combat that Beric himself had called for. The Brotherhood had captured the hound, accused him of crimes he had committed in service to the Lannisters, and Beric offered him trial by combat, the old way of letting the gods decide guilt or innocence through battle. The hound's sword cut through Beric's defences, split him nearly in half, a wound so terrible that there could be no doubt of death. But Thoros prayed again, and Beric returned again, though this time pieces of his memory were clearly gone, names he should have known were suddenly absent, faces he should have recognised were now unfamiliar. The fourth, fifth, and sixth deaths came in various circumstances over the following months and years, an arrow through the throat, a fall from a cliff that broke his neck, another sword thrust, this one through the belly, that left him dying slowly over hours before Thoros could reach him and perform the ritual. Each time he returned, and each time he was less than he had been. His voice grew rough and strange. His eyes, which had once been bright with life and humour, became distant, fixed on something the others could not see. He ate little, slept less, seemed to need fewer of the things that sustain ordinary human life, as if he was becoming something in between, neither fully alive nor acceptably dead. The men of the Brotherhood watched this transformation with unease. They depended on Beric's leadership, his sense of justice, his unwavering commitment to protecting the small folk even when such protection seemed futile. But they could see what the resurrections were doing to him, could see him fading like a garment that has been washed too many times, the colours running, the fabric thinning. Some began to question whether it was mercy to keep bringing him back, whether Thoros was saving Beric or torturing him, stretching out a death that should have been allowed to be final. And Beric himself seemed to wonder the same thing. He spoke once, in a moment of unusual clarity, about how his memories were departing like birds flying south, one by one, leaving until there would be nothing left but the empty sky. He could no longer remember his castle, could not recall what his sisters looked like, could not bring to mind the songs his mother sang when he was a child. These things that had made him who he was, that had given texture and meaning to his life, were gone, burned away by each passage through death and return. What remained was the mission, the purpose, the absolute conviction that he had to protect the innocent, but even that conviction was no longer rooted in personal experience or emotional connection. It was abstract, pure, like a mathematical formula that required no feeling to execute. Thoros struggled with what he was doing each time he performed the resurrection ritual. He had not asked for this power, had not sought it, and now that he possessed it, he found it to be a burden as much as a gift. He watched Beric diminish, watched the man become a hollow version of himself, and wondered if R'hllor truly wanted this. If the Lord of Light was genuinely demanding these repeated returns, or if Thoros himself was simply unable to let go, unable to allow death when he had the power to prevent it. The prayer became harder each time, required more of him, as if he was reaching further and further to pull Beric back from wherever he went when he died. But Beric insisted. He spoke the prayer himself, though he was not a priest, spoke the words that Thoros had spoken over his body 6 times, and he gave his life willingly, poured what remained of himself into the corpse before him. The fire that had kept him alive through 6 deaths finally went out, and Beric Dondarrion died a 7th and final time, and this death was at last permanent, accepted by both R'hllor and by whatever dark forces wait beyond the threshold of mortality. And Catelyn Stark's eyes opened, and she rose, and what came back was not quite Catelyn, not quite the woman she had been, but something harder, colder, driven by a single purpose that burned in her with the intensity of hatred rather than the warmth of life. Lady Stoneheart, they called her, this revenant that wore Catelyn's face, and she led the Brotherhood down darker paths than Beric had ever taken them. She hanged Freys and Lannisters, and anyone who had supported the Red Wedding showed no mercy, no compassion, only an endless appetite for vengeance. This was the cost of resurrection when performed on someone too long dead, when the soul had lingered too long in darkness before being called back. What returned was twisted, broken, consumed by the strongest emotion that had marked the moment of death. Catelyn had died seeing her son murdered, had died with a mother's grief and fury, and that grief and fury was what animated Lady Stoneheart, with none of the love or gentleness or complexity that had made Catelyn Stark who she was. Beric's sacrifice revealed something about resurrection that was both beautiful and terrible. The power to return life was not unlimited, not something that could be called upon infinitely. There was a cost, a balance that had to be maintained. Beric could give Catelyn life because he had been given life 6 times himself, because he had accumulated some kind of debt or credit with R'hllor that he could spend in this final act. And in spending it, in choosing to die so that another might live, even if that life was twisted and dark, he fulfilled whatever purpose the Lord of Light had kept him alive to fulfill. Jon Snow had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a position he never sought and found himself ill-suited for in many ways. He was too young, too idealistic, too willing to make hard choices that alienated those he commanded. When he allowed the wildlings south of the Wall, saving thousands of lives but violating centuries of Night's Watch tradition, he created enemies among his own men. When he announced his intention to march south to fight Ramsay Bolton, he crossed a line that the Watch could not accept, and his brothers rose against him in the courtyard of Castle Black and stabbed him repeatedly, crying, "For the Watch," with each thrust of their knives. Jon died in the snow, his blood pooling beneath him, his dire wolf ghost howling in anguish somewhere nearby. His body was brought inside, protected by loyal men who were uncertain what to do but knew that they could not allow the traitors who killed him to mutilate or dispose of the corpse. Melisandre looked upon Jon's body and felt the weight of all her failures, all her false certainties. She had proclaimed Stannis as Azor Ahai, and Stannis was dead or dying in the snows of the north. She had promised victory and delivered only defeat, and yet her flames continued to show her Snow, this dead boy before her, and she wondered if perhaps there was still something she could do. Some way to serve Rella's purpose, even in the midst of her catastrophic misunderstanding of that purpose. She performed the ritual that Thoros had stumbled upon, that the Red Priests teach to their most. When Melisandre learned that Jon had returned, that the resurrection had worked despite her doubt, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that her power was not gone, that R'hllor had answered after all. Confusion about why the god had chosen to bring Jon back when he had allowed Stannis to fall, and a growing suspicion that perhaps Jon was what her flames had been trying to tell her all along, that this was Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, and everything she had proclaimed about Stannis was simply wrong, a misinterpretation so fundamental that it had shaped years of her service and led to consequences she would never be able to undo. The two resurrections, Beric's 6 and Jon's 1, raise profound questions about the nature of death and life in this world, about what it means to be human, about whether the soul persists beyond the body's end. The maesters, those scholars who study the natural world and seek rational explanations for all phenomena, are divided on how to interpret these events. Some simply deny that they happened, claim that Beric and Jon never truly died but were merely gravely injured and recovered naturally, and that the prayers of the Red Priests are coincidental rather than causative. Others acknowledge that something happened but refuse to call it divine intervention, preferring to speak of magic, of forces not yet understood by science, but not necessarily supernatural. But those who witnessed the resurrections directly, who saw the bodies cold and lifeless, and then saw them rise, cannot easily dismiss what they experienced. There is a power at work, something that can pull souls back from whatever realm they enter upon death, something that the Red Priests can channel through their prayers and their faith. Whether this power is Ora'ala, a conscious divine being who chooses when to answer and when to remain silent, or whether it is simply magic that the priests have learned to manipulate through ritual and belief, the practical effect is the same. The dead can return, though not all dead, and not without cost. The cost is worth contemplating carefully. Beric lost pieces of himself with each resurrection, memories and personality and humanity gradually stripped away, until what remained was barely a person at all. Jon lost something less tangible, but perhaps equally significant, a warmth, a connection to others, an innocence about the finality of death, and those who perform the resurrections pay a cost as well. Thoros aged visibly with each resurrection he performed, as if years of his life were being burned up to fuel the miracle. Melisandre, already ancient through her magic, seemed diminished after bringing Jon back, less certain, less powerful, as if the act had taken something from her that could not be easily replaced. And there is the cost to those who love the resurrected. To see someone die, to mourn them, to begin the painful process of acceptance and moving forward, and then to have them return but changed, not quite who they were, creates a kind of grief that has no name. You cannot mourn the dead because they are not dead, but you cannot celebrate their return because they are not truly back. What stands before you wears the face of the person you loved but carries something foreign inside, something that passed through death and brought back echoes of that darkness. The question of why R'hllor brings some back and not others is perhaps unanswerable. Thousands die every day in Westeros and Essos, the innocent and the guilty, the young and the old, and almost all of them stay dead as the natural order demands. Why Beric? Why Jon? What made them special? What purpose did they have yet to fulfill that required their return? The Red Priests say that R'hllor has a plan, that each resurrection serves the greater cause of light against darkness, that the Lord of Light sees the future and acts to shape it according to his divine will. But this raises troubling theological questions. If R'hllor can bring back the dead, Why does he not bring back all the innocent victims of violence and war? Why not return the murdered children, the slain mothers, the young men killed in battles they never wanted to fight? What makes Beric and Jon worthy of resurrection, when so many others, equally deserving or more so, are left to rot in the ground or burn on pyres? The faithful answer that we cannot understand the mind of God, that R'hllor's purposes are beyond human comprehension, that our sense of justice or fairness is too limited to judge divine action. But the skeptics hear in this answer an admission that the theology makes no sense, that it is simply power exercised according to inscrutable whim, with no moral framework that would justify calling it good. What returns when the dead rise is perhaps the most fundamental mystery. Are they truly the same person, the soul that inhabited that body restored fully to its place? Or are they something new? A different entity that carries the memories and personality of the dead but is not, in the deeper sense, that person returned? The philosophers and theologians could debate this endlessly without resolution, because there is no way to verify the continuity of consciousness, no test that could prove whether the spark that makes someone themselves truly persists through death and resurrection, or whether what returns is a remarkably convincing copy. The resurrections that we have witnessed, these 7 returns from death, may be just the beginning of something larger, or they may be exceptions, rare moments when the barrier between life and death grew thin enough for crossing. The Red Priests teach that in the coming conflict between R'hllor and the Great Other, between fire and ice, the rules that normally govern mortality may break down entirely, that resurrection may become more common, easier, necessary for the survival of a life itself against the forces of death. Whether this is prophecy or hope or warning we cannot yet say, but the fact that any resurrection is possible, that death can be reversed through prayer and faith and power, changes fundamentally how we must think about mortality, about what we are, about whether the end is truly final or merely a door that can, under certain circumstances, be opened from the other side. The resurrections we have contemplated, the return of the dead to life through R'hllor's power, or through magic channeled by his priests, point towards something larger than individual miracles or theological curiosities. They suggest that the faith's central claim, its foundational narrative about the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between fire and ice, between life and death, might not be merely metaphorical or mythological, but in some sense literally true. The God who brings back the dead opposes an enemy who creates the dead, who raises them not to life but to a horrible mockery of it, and this opposition between resurrection and reanimation, between warm life and cold undeath, frames the greatest existential threat that Westeros has faced in thousands of years. The wall was built after the Long Night, or perhaps during its final years, a massive structure of ice and magic rising 700 feet high and stretching for 300 miles across the north of Westeros. It was meant to keep the White Walkers and their dead armies from returning south, and for 8,000 years it served that purpose, so effectively that most people forgot why it had been built. Forgot that the others were real, dismissed them as legends that nurses told to frighten children. The Night's Watch, sworn to guard the wall and the realms of men, became a dumping ground for criminals and bastards, their true purpose forgotten, their warnings about movements in the haunted forest dismissed as superstitious nonsense by southern lords who had never seen winter as it truly is in the far north. The connection between the White Walkers and the Great Other is a matter of theology and interpretation. The Red Priests see the others as servants of their god's enemy, as physical manifestations of the darkness and cold that R'hllor opposes. Whether the White Walkers worship the Great Other, or are simply aligned with the same cosmic principle of death and ice, whether they are conscious agents of a divine being, or simply creatures whose nature happens to match the theological description of R'hllor's enemy, these questions have no clear answer. The White Walkers do not speak, do not explain their purposes, do not engage in dialogue or negotiation. They simply march south, bringing winter with them, raising the dead, killing everything that lives. The whites that the White Walkers create are the inverse of resurrection, a dark mirror of what Thoros and Melisandre accomplish when they bring back the dead. Where resurrection restores a person, brings them back warm and breathing, and at least partially themselves, reanimation creates a puppet, a corpse that walks and fights, but carries no consciousness, no will, no trace of the person it was. The blue eyes of the whites are a mark of the magic that animates them, a sign that they are no longer human but tools of the Night King, extensions of his will that operate without thought or feeling, or any capacity for mercy or hesitation. Fire destroys the whites, burns them as it burns anything dead and cold. This is one of the few weapons that is reliably effective against the army of the dead, and it is not coincidental that fire is R'hllor's element, his gift, his manifestation in the world. The Red Priests see in this another proof of their theology, evidence that their god provides the tools necessary to fight the darkness. Dragonglass, the volcanic glass that the Valyrians call dragonsteel, also kills White Walkers when driven into their bodies, shatters them into ice that melts away as if they had never been. And Valyrian steel, forged in dragonfire in the days before the Doom, carries some quality that allows it to stand against the others, to cut through their icy forms when ordinary steel shatters on contact. The existence of these weapons, these specific vulnerabilities, suggests that the war between fire and ice has been fought before, that knowledge about how to fight the White Walkers was preserved through the millennia, even as memory of the others themselves faded into legend. The Children of the Forest created the White Walkers using dragonglass, and dragonglass destroys them, a symmetry that may be meaningful or may be simple poetry of cause and effect. The dragons that the Targaryens brought to Westeros were creatures of fire, and the dragon fire they breathed could melt ice and burn whites, making them potentially devastating weapons against the Night King's army. Though whether R'hllor had any hand in preserving the dragon bloodline through the Doom and the centuries that followed is another question that theology might answer one way and skepticism another. The theology of R'hllor maps onto the threat of the White Walkers almost perfectly, as if the faith was designed specifically to prepare for this conflict. The eternal struggle between light and darkness becomes literal when the darkness takes physical form as the Night King and his army. The promise that Azor Ahai will return to fight the enemy becomes urgent when that enemy is actually marching south, actually raising the dead, actually threatening to bring the long night again. The emphasis on fire as sacred, as the weapon and the symbol of R'hllor's power, makes practical sense when fire is one of the few things that can destroy the ice creatures and their undead servants. The long night that came 8,000 years ago lasted a generation, according to the histories, though given how long ago it was and how thoroughly records from that era have been lost, the exact duration is uncertain. What is clear is that it was catastrophic, that whole civilizations were nearly wiped out, that humanity came frighteningly close to extinction. The Azor Ahai of legend supposedly ended the long night by forging Lightbringer and using it to drive back the darkness, but the details of how this was accomplished are lost, transformed into myth, impossible to verify or even to understand. Did Azor Ahai kill the Night King? Did he destroy the White Walkers entirely? Or merely force them to retreat? Did the long night end because of his actions? Or did it end naturally, cyclically, and his heroism happened to coincide with the darkness lifting for other reasons? The Battle of Winterfell, in the version of history where such a battle took place, was the culmination of everything the faith of R'hllor had been preparing for. The moment when the prophecies and the training and the resurrections all came together to face the existential threat that the White Walkers represented. The Night King came south, with an army numbering in the tens of thousands, perhaps more than 100,000 whites, corpses of wildlings and Northmen and even giants, all animated by his cold magic, all marching in perfect silent unity toward the castle where the living had gathered to make their stand. The dead do not tire, do not fear, do not break ranks or flee or require food or rest. They are the perfect army for a war of extinction, relentless and inevitable and terrible. The living had fire, and they had dragonglass weapons that the smiths had been forging frantically, and they had a few Valyrian steel swords among them, and they had dragons, the 3 that Daenerys Targaryen had brought to Westeros after they had been extinct for more than a century. And they had Melisandre, who appeared at the battle's beginning and used her magic to set alight the weapons of the Dothraki cavalry, to ignite the trenches that had been dug around Winterfell, to provide the fire that was necessary to fight the ice. Her powers were real and significant. Whatever doubts she may have harboured about her interpretations of prophecy, the magic itself worked. The flame she conjured burned hot and true and destroyed the wights that they touched. The battle was desperate and terrible, the living pushed back again and again by the relentless advance of the dead. The dragons fought the Night King's reanimated dragon, fire against ice in the sky above the battlefield, a spectacle both beautiful and horrifying. Thoros of Myr, had he lived to see it, would have understood it as the ultimate expression of the conflict his faith described. Huller and the Great Other locked in combat, using humans and dragons and wights as their pieces in a game, where the stakes were the continuation or extinction of all warm life in the world. The Night King was destroyed, though accounts differ on exactly how this happened and what it meant. Some versions say he was killed by a Valyrian steel blade wielded by a skilled fighter at a crucial moment. Others suggest that his destruction was the result of magic, of fire meeting ice in a way that shattered the spell that had animated him for thousands of years. What is certain is that when the Night King died, all the White Walkers died with him, and all the wights collapsed into lifeless corpses once more. The magic that animated them severed by the destruction of the one who had created them. The threat was ended, the darkness pushed back, the long night prevented from returning. But what does this victory mean for the faith of R'hllor? If the Great Other's servants are destroyed, if the existential threat that the entire theology was oriented around no longer exists, what purpose does the faith serve going forward? The Red Priests might argue that vigilance is still necessary, that the darkness might return in other forms, that the struggle between light and dark continues even if this particular battle has been won. Or they might see the defeat of the Night King as the fulfillment of prophecy, the completion of R'hllor's plan. Arisasdiat, and the faith might transform into something different, less urgent, less focused on apocalypse and more concerned with the daily work of choosing life over death in smaller, more ordinary ways. Melisandre herself did not survive the battle, at least not in some versions of the story. After the Night King was destroyed, after her purpose was fulfilled, she walked out into the snow and removed her choker, allowed her true age to catch up with her, and died as the sun rose. Her body crumbling to dust, her centuries of life finally ending now that the task she had been preserved to accomplish was complete. It was a fitting end in many ways, a recognition that she was a tool of something larger than herself, that her life had meaning only in relation to the battle against darkness, and now that the battle was won, there was no need for her to continue. Or perhaps she lives still in another version, continuing to serve R'hllor, continuing to interpret flames and offer counsel, though with more humility now, more awareness of how wrong she'd been about so much, how her certainty had led her to commit acts she could never undo, and could barely justify even in light of the victory that had been achieved. The faith continues regardless. The temples still burn their sacred fires. The priests still pray at dawn and dusk, still speak of the eternal struggle between light and dark, even if the most obvious manifestation of that struggle has been resolved for now. The question remains whether the White Walkers were truly servants of the Great Other, or simply creatures whose nature happened to align with the theological concept of a dark god. The Night King never spoke of gods or worship, never indicated that he served any purpose beyond his own inscrutable will. He might have been a true agent of cosmic darkness, animated by a divine enemy of a Rahala, or he might have been simply what he appeared to be, a magical creation gone wrong, a weapon that turned on its makers and nearly destroyed the world through mindless expansion and the imperative to turn all life into death. The theology of R'hllor requires the Great Other to be real, to be personal, to be actively opposing the Lord of Light, but the physical evidence is more ambiguous, suggests only that there are forces in the world that align with ice and death, and these forces came very close to extinguishing all warmth and life before being stopped. Melisandre had the statues dragged out of the sept and piled together in a great mound on the beach at Dragonstone. She soaked them in oil and set them ablaze at night, creating a bonfire that could be seen for miles, the wooden gods burning as she chanted prayers in High Valyrian, calling upon R'hllor to witness the destruction of falsehood, the cleansing of Dragonstone from the taint of the wrong faith. Stannis stood and watched, his face carved from stone, committing himself to this new path, this foreign god, this red woman's visions of his destiny. Many of his followers were horrified, saw in the burning of the Seven a sacrilege that would damn them all, a turning away from the gods of their fathers towards something alien and dangerous. And they were not wrong to be horrified, though perhaps not for the reasons they articulated. The burning of the Seven was more than religious vandalism. It was a statement of absolute confidence, a declaration that Melisandre knew without doubt that the Seven were false and R'hllor true, that the old faith deserved no respect or accommodation, that the urgency of the coming battle justified the destruction of traditions that had sustained millions of people for thousands of years. This kind of certainty is always dangerous, because it removes the natural hesitation that might prevent excess, the doubt that might counsel caution or compromise. Melisandre had no doubt, and so she burned the gods without hesitation, without considering that perhaps there was value in the old faiths, that perhaps destroying what people held sacred might not be the best way to win them to a new cause. Maester Cressen's death, though not technically a burning, was another early indication of the cost of Melisandre's influence. The old Maester had served House Baratheon faithfully for decades, had helped raise Stannis from a boy, had advised him with wisdom and care. But he saw in Melisandre a threat, a sorceress who was leading his lord astray with prophecies and promises that could only end in disaster. He tried to kill her with poison, a desperate act by a desperate man who saw no other way to save the house he had served all his life. Melisandre drank the poison and did not die, demonstrating her power, her protection by R'hllor or by her own magic. And Maester Cressen died instead. The poison he had taken himself to allay suspicion doing its terrible work while she watched unmoved. She could have saved him, perhaps. She had shown herself capable of miraculous things, and poison might have been within her power to neutralize in another if she chose. But she did not choose. She let the old man die, saw it as necessary, as the removal of an obstacle to R'hllor's plan. This calculus, this willingness to allow or cause death when it serves what one believes is a higher purpose, is characteristic of Melisandre's approach throughout. People are not ends in themselves, but means, tools to be used in the service of prophecy, pieces to be sacrificed when the game requires it. The concept of king's blood is central to the faith's most troubling practices. The Red Priests teach that those descended from royal lines carry magic in their veins, power that can be released through their death and channeled toward great purposes. Whether this is true in any objective sense, whether royal blood actually contains magical properties that common blood does not, is difficult to verify. But Melisandre and other Red Priests certainly act as if they believe it, and the sacrifices they advocate are always of those with the royal lineage, never of common folk whose blood is presumed to lack the necessary potency. Mance Rayder's burning, or what was believed to be Mance Rayder's burning, illustrates the complicated morality of these acts. Mance was the king beyond the wall, the leader of the wildlings who had united the free folk and led them south in desperate flight from the White Walkers. He was captured after his army was defeated by Stannis' intervention at the wall, and Melisandre declared that he must burn because he refused to kneel to Stannis, refused to acknowledge the king she had proclaimed as Azor Ahai. Jon Snow, watching the preparations for the burning, was horrified by the cruelty of it, by the sight of a brave man about to die in agony for the crime of maintaining his dignity and independence. She counselled Stannis to burn his daughter, to tie Shireen to a pyre and set her aflame as a sacrifice to R'hllor, to trade his child's life for the magical assistance that would save his army and achieve his destiny. The proposal was monstrous, and Stannis knew it was monstrous, and yet he was desperate enough, convinced enough of the importance of his cause, broken enough by the weight of his failures that he agreed. Or perhaps he was simply too weak to resist Melisandre's certainty, too worn down by her constant assurances that this was necessary, that R'hllor demanded it, that everything would be worth it in the end. Shireen was brought to the pyre, tied to the stake. She was confused at first, didn't understand what was happening, asked for her father, asked why they were doing this to her. When she realized what was about to happen, when the torches were brought forward and the prayers began, she screamed for her father, begged him to save her, cried out with the terror and betrayal that any child would feel in such a moment. Stannis watched, his face a mask, forcing himself to witness what he had ordered, not allowing himself to look away even as his child burned and screamed and died in agony. We cannot answer this question with certainty, because we cannot run the experiment, cannot see what would have happened if the sacrifices had not been performed. But what we can say is that even if the magic is real, even if burning King's blood does produce tangible benefits, the moral question remains. Does achieving magical power justify burning people alive? Does winning a battle or gaining a vision make it acceptable to tie a child to a stake and set her on fire? Most moral frameworks, most religious traditions would say no, would insist that there are some acts that are wrong regardless of their consequences, that some lines should not be crossed even if crossing them would save the world. Davos Seaworth represents the voice of conscience throughout these events, the ordinary man who looks at what the Red Priestess counsels and recoils, who insists that there must be limits, that not everything can be justified by invoking prophecy and destiny. Davos is no philosopher, no educated theologian who can debate the finer points of faith and morals. He is a former smuggler raised to lordship by Stannis' favour, a man who believes in loyalty and duty and basic human decency. And his basic human decency tells him that burning children is wrong, is something that no prophecy can justify, that Stannis and Melisandre are crossing lines that should never be crossed, regardless of what the flames supposedly show or promise. But Davos's voice, though persistent, was not ultimately persuasive enough to prevent the worst from happening. He saved Edric Storm by acting in direct defiance of orders, but he could not save Shireen, was not present when she burned, could not intervene to spare her. And this failure, this inability to prevent the atrocity despite his moral clarity and his loyalty and his courage, represents perhaps the deepest tragedy of the entire situation. The good people who see what is wrong cannot always stop it, cannot always prevent those in power from making catastrophic moral choices, especially when those in power are convinced that they are serving some higher purpose that justifies any means. The burnings and sacrifices performed in R'hllor's name reveal something about the nature of faith when it becomes absolute. When doubt is banished and certainty reigns, religion at its best can inspire compassion, can motivate people to care for the vulnerable, can create communities of support and meaning that help people navigate the difficulties of life. But religion at its worst can sanctify cruelty, can transform atrocity into virtue, can convince people that the screams of the burning are prayers that rise to heaven, rather than protests against injustice. R'hllor's faith has shown both faces, has produced both Thoros' humble uncertainty and Melisandre's terrible certainty, has motivated both genuine heroism and unspeakable cruelty. But the skeptic would point out that apparent purpose can arise from pattern recognition. from the human tendency to see intention where there is only coincidence or natural causation. The flames show images, and the priestess interprets those images in ways that seem meaningful to her. But perhaps the images themselves are random or generated by the priestess's own unconscious mind, her hopes and fears and expectations creating the visions rather than receiving them from an external source. Beric comes back with a sense of purpose, but perhaps that purpose is something he creates himself, a meaning he imposes on his resurrection rather than a mission given to him by a god. We are meaning-making creatures, and we will find purpose and pattern even in chaos, especially when we desperately want those things to be there. The question of answered prayers is particularly interesting and difficult. Thoros prays for Beric to return, and Beric returns. Does this prove that Halor heard and answered the prayer? Not necessarily. It might simply prove that the words of the prayer are a spell, a magical formula that works when spoken with the right intention and energy, regardless of whether any god is listening. Magic often requires specific words and gestures and rituals, and perhaps the resurrection prayer is simply one more magical ritual, no different in principle from a spell to create fire or to see visions, operating according to magical laws rather than divine will. But Thoros himself finds this explanation unsatisfying, and his perspective is worth taking seriously because he actually performed the resurrections. He experienced what it felt like from the inside. He says that when he prayed, he felt something, a power that flowed through him but did not originate from him, a presence that responded to his request. He speaks of this with humility, with awareness that he might be mistaken, but also with the conviction of someone who knows what he experienced even if he cannot prove it to others. This phenomenology, this first-person experience of divine presence, is not evidence that would convince a skeptic, but it matters to the believer, shapes how the faithful understand their relationship with the God they serve. Melisandre's perspective is both similar and different. She also experiences power flowing through her, feels that she is a conduit rather than the source of the magic she wields, but she is more confident than Thoros, more certain that she understands what she is experiencing and what it means. And this confidence leads her into error, leads her to mistake her interpretation for divine truth, to confuse her desires and expectations with R'hllor's will. Her story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of certainty, about how even genuine contact with power or with something numinous can be misunderstood, filtered through the believer's preconceptions and biases until what they think they know is very different from what is actually true. The crucial moment that reveals the limits of Melisandre's understanding comes when she realizes that Stannis is not Azor Ahai, that all her proclamations and prophecies and certainties were wrong. She had seen Stannis in her flames, had interpreted the visions as confirmation that he was the promised hero, had devoted years of her life to supporting his claim and counselling his decisions, and she was wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. This revelation shakes her to her core, forces her to confront the possibility that everything she thought she understood about R'hllor's will and about her role in the cosmic battle between light and dark was based on misinterpretation. But notice what does not shake. Her belief that R'hllor is real, that the visions in the flames are genuine, that the power she wields comes from the Lord of Light. Even in her moment of greatest doubt, even when she contemplates removing her choker and letting death claim her, she does not doubt the reality of the god, only her ability to correctly interpret what the god is showing her. This is important because it reveals how faith operates for someone like Melisandre. The existence of R'hllor is foundational, is more certain than any particular interpretation of his messages, more fundamental than any specific prophecy or promise. She can doubt herself without doubting the god, can admit that she was wrong about Stannis without admitting that she might be wrong about R'hllor. This is consistent with how many religious traditions understand divine communication. God speaks in riddles and parables, reveals truth obliquely rather than directly, requires faith and interpretation rather than providing certainty. The difficulty of understanding is itself meaningful. Is a test or a teaching or simply the natural consequence of trying to grasp the infinite with finite minds? From this perspective, Melisandre's errors do not disprove Rella's existence, but rather demonstrate the challenge of serving a god whose purposes and methods are beyond human comprehension. The skeptic might respond that this is convenient, that it makes the theology unfalsifiable. If every apparent confirmation of R'hllor's existence is taken as proof, while every error or failed prophecy is explained away as human misinterpretation, then what would count as evidence against the god's reality? How could the faith ever be proven wrong if any failure can be attributed to the believers rather than to problems with the belief itself? This is a serious challenge, and it is one that many religious traditions struggle with. Faith that is too flexible, that can accommodate any outcome, may not actually be making meaningful claims about reality at all, but perhaps there is a middle position, a way of understanding the faith of R'hllor that takes seriously both the evidence for magical power and the uncertainty about its source and nature. We might say that something is real, something that the Red Priests access through their prayers and rituals, something that can restore life and grant visions and manifest as fire. Whether this something is a R'hllor as the priests conceive him, a conscious divine being with will and purpose and concern for humanity, or whether it is something else, something more alien or more impersonal that the priests have interpreted through their theological categories, this question might be unanswerable, might be beyond our capacity to resolve with certainty. What we can say is that the faith works, in a pragmatic sense. The prayers produce results, the rituals channel power, the visions contain true information. The theology provides a framework that helps believers make sense of their experiences and orient themselves toward action in the world. Whether the framework is literally true in all its details, whether R'hllor is actually a conscious being or merely a name given to forces that exist independently of belief, might matter less than the fact that the faith enables people to access real power, to work genuine magic, to achieve things that would be impossible without it. The question of what is real and what is seen, what is divine and what is magical, what is prophecy and what is interpretation, ultimately cannot be answered definitively from outside the faith. Those who have experienced the power, who have felt something respond to their prayers, who have seen the dead return to life through their words, they have knowledge that cannot be communicated to those who have not shared the experience. And those who have not experienced these things directly have no basis for judging whether the experiences are genuine encounters with the divine or delusions generated by their own minds in conjunction with magical forces that exist independently of any god. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps faith requires this gap between experience and proof, this space where belief is possible but not compelled, where different interpretations remain available, and people must choose what framework makes the most sense of their experiences and observations. R'hllor may be real, may be watching, may be working to save the world from darkness through his priests and their magic, or the power may be real while the theology is metaphor, a human construction that allows access to forces that exist independently of belief. We can live with this uncertainty, can acknowledge the reality of magic and miracle while remaining humble about our understanding of their ultimate source and meaning. And perhaps in that humility, that acceptance of mystery, we find something closer to wisdom than any amount of certainty could provide. This practical demonstration of power did more to spread the faith than centuries of preaching had accomplished. People began to convert not necessarily because they believed in R'hllor as the priests understood him, but because they wanted access to the magic, wanted the protection that fire offered against ice, wanted to be on the side that had demonstrated it could resurrect the dead and see the future and channel power that saved lives. This is perhaps not the kind of faith that the Red Priests would prefer, faith born from pragmatism rather than genuine spiritual conviction, but it is faith nonetheless, and it brought new followers, new temples, new recognition of Rulla's name in places where it had never been spoken before. The temples in King's Landing and other major cities grew in size and influence after the defeat of the Night King. The Red Priests found themselves welcomed rather than merely tolerated, consulted on matters of policy and magic, granted positions of respect if not quite equal to what the Septons of the Seven enjoyed. This growth in temporal power brought its own challenges and corruptions. Some Red Priests became politicians in scarlet robes, more interested in influence and wealth than in serving the light, using their mystique to gain advantages in the Game of Thrones that continued even after the existential threat had been defeated. Others remained true to the faith's original purpose, focused on preparing for dangers that might yet come, maintaining the sacred fires, teaching the prayers, passing on the knowledge of how to fight darkness wherever it might manifest. The question of how to understand the faith after the White Walkers were defeated occupied theological debates within the Red Priesthood for years. If the Great Other's servants were destroyed, if the Long Night had been prevented, did that mean Rulla had triumphed, that the cosmic battle was won, that the faith could now focus on celebration rather than preparation? Or was this merely one battle in an eternal war, one victory in a struggle that would continue as long as fire and ice existed, as long as life and death remained in tension? Different temples came to different conclusions, and the faith that had seemed so unified in its message when the threat was immediate began to fracture into factions with different emphases and different understandings of what Rulla required of his followers now that the prophecies seemed to have been fulfilled. Some Red Priests argued that the faith should moderate, should abandon the practice of human sacrifice now that the crisis had passed, should focus on the aspects of the theology that emphasized life and light and warmth, rather than the darker elements that had justified burnings. These reformers pointed to Shireen's death as a stain on the faith that needed to be addressed, acknowledged, repented. They said that Rulla is a god of life and should never have been invoked to justify burning a child, that Melisandre's counsel in that moment was wrong and should be recognized as wrong, that the faith needed to establish clear limits on what could be done in the Lord of Light's name. Other priests resisted this reform, argued that the willingness to sacrifice, to pay terrible prices in service to the light, was essential to the faith's power and purpose. They said that soft religion, religion that made no difficult demands, religion that never required people to do hard things, such religion might be more popular, but it would be less effective, less capable of producing the miracles and the magic that had helped save the world. They pointed out that the resurrections required sacrifice, that Beric had to die so that Catelyn could live, that great magic always demands great price, and that trying to sanitize the faith would rob it of its power and reduce it to empty ritual. This tension between the reformers and the traditionalists shaped the faith's evolution in the years following the Great Battle. In some cities the reforms took hold, and the Red Temples became places of light and warmth and community, emphasizing prayer and vision and the daily choice to serve life rather than death, abandoning the burnings and the blood magic. In other cities the traditional practices continued, the sacred fires still fed with sacrifices, the priests still teaching that king's blood holds power and that Rella demands offerings. The faith became more diverse, more fragmented, less able to speak with a single voice, but perhaps also more adaptable, more capable of meeting different people's needs in different contexts. Melisandre herself, in the versions of the story where she survived the battle, became a figure of complex legacy within the faith. Some saw her as the greatest priestess of the age, the woman who had stood at the centre of world-saving events, who had resurrected the hero who defeated the Night King, who had wielded power beyond what any other Red Priest could match. Others saw her as a cautionary tale, the embodiment of the dangers of certainty, the priest whose errors had led to terrible consequences, whose absolute conviction that she understood Rella's will had resulted in the burning of an innocent child and the misdirection of effort towards Stannis when the true hero was someone else entirely. Melisandre's own understanding of her role and her failures deepened in the years after the battle. she spent less time proclaiming prophecy and more time simply tending flames, watching the visions without claiming to understand them fully, offering counsel when asked but with qualifications and uncertainties, rather than absolute pronouncements. She seemed to have learned, finally, the lesson that Thoros had embodied from the beginning. That serving Rahala did not require understanding everything, that working miracles did not confer wisdom about their meaning, that the appropriate response to mystery was humble attention rather than confident interpretation. Whether this chastened Melisandre represents the future of the faith, or merely one individual's response to personal failure, remains to be seen. But her transformation from absolute certainty to humble uncertainty offers a model that many within the faith found compelling, a way of maintaining belief while acknowledging limitation, a path between the extremes of dogmatic conviction and complete skepticism. She became, in her later years, less frightening and more approachable. Less the powerful sorceress and more the wise teacher who could help others learn to see in the flames without claiming to know exactly what the flames meant. Thoros did not survive to see the final battle. Died in the cold during the journey beyond the wall, his work complete, or at least complete enough that R'hllor no longer sustained him. His legacy within the faith is simpler and perhaps more profound than Melisandre's. He is remembered as the drunk priest who found faith through miracle, the man who brought back the dead 6 times despite not fully believing it would work, the humble servant who demonstrated that R'hllor can work through anyone, that devotion matters more than understanding, that sometimes the greatest miracles come through those who doubt rather than those who are certain. His story inspired many within the faith, particularly those who struggled with their own doubts, who wanted to believe but could not quite manage absolute conviction. Thoros proved that doubt did not disqualify one from service, that R'hllor could work through uncertain vessels, that faith was more about showing up and speaking the prayers than about having all the answers or maintaining perfect confidence. This message resonated in a world where so many people had seen things that challenged their understanding, where magic and miracle had become real but remained inexplicable, where the old certainties had been shattered, but new certainties seemed dangerous and presumptuous. Jon Snow's relationship with the faith remained complicated throughout his life. He had been brought back through R'hllor's power or through magic channeled by Melisandre's prayers, but he never converted to the faith, never adopted its theology, never spoke the dawn and dusk prayers or burned offerings to the Lord of Light. He acknowledged that something had returned him to life, was grateful for the second chance even as he struggled with what it meant and what it had cost, but he could not bring himself to worship R'hllor in the way that Melisandre hoped he would. His gods remained the old gods if he had any gods at all, the silent weirwoods of his childhood, the faith that asked nothing and promised nothing, and simply was. This relationship, respectful but not devoted, complicated but genuine, perhaps represents how many people in Westeros came to relate to R'hllor's faith. They acknowledged its power, recognized that the Red Priest could do things that no one else could do, appreciated that the faith had played a crucial role in defeating the darkness. But they could not quite bring themselves to full belief, could not accept the theology wholesale, could not embrace the rituals and the worldview that the faith required. They were grateful but not converted, impressed but not devoted, willing to work with the Red Priests but not to become Red Priests themselves. Some people sought out the Red Priests after losing someone, begged them to perform the resurrection ritual, offered money or service or anything they had if only the priests would bring back a dead child or spouse or parent. The priests almost always refused, explained that resurrection did not work that way, that R'hllor chose when to restore life and human desire could not compel him, that the prayer only worked when the god willed it to work. These refusals were painful for those who had hoped for miracles, felt like cruelty or at least like indifference, but they were probably necessary to prevent the faith from being overwhelmed with demands it could not fulfill, to maintain the boundary between what the priest could do and what they could not. There were stories, perhaps apocryphal, of red priests who tried to resurrect someone and succeeded, brought back a person who had not been meant to return, and the results were always terrible in these stories. The person came back wrong, twisted, more like Lady Stoneheart than like Jon Snow, consumed by darkness rather than restored to life. These stories served as warnings, reinforced the teaching that resurrection should not be attempted casually, that it was dangerous magic that could go horribly wrong if not performed for the right reasons at the right time with the right person. Whether the stories were true or merely cautionary tales invented to discourage people from demanding resurrections, they were effective in maintaining the sense that bringing back the dead was sacred and dangerous, not something to be done lightly or frequently. The dragons that Daenerys Targaryen brought back to the world, that fought against the Night King's forces, that represented fire made flesh, were seen by many in the faith as proof that R'hllor was real and active in the world. The prophecy of Azor Ahai spoke of waking dragons from stone, and dragons had indeed been woken, had hatched from eggs that had been stone for generations. Whether Daenerys herself was Azor Ahai or Jon Snow, or both of them together, or someone else entirely, or whether Azor Ahai was not a person but a moment, a convergence of forces that saved the world, these questions were debated endlessly by the Red Priests and never definitively resolved. But the dragon's existence was not debatable, and their power was evident to anyone who saw them fly, or heard them roar, or witnessed the devastation their fire could cause. They were creatures of R'hllor if R'hllor was the god of fire, were living proof that the world still held magic, that the forces the Red Priests spoke of were real, and could manifest in forms both beautiful and terrible. When the dragons died, as eventually they did because even dragons are mortal, it felt to many like a dimming of the light, as if the world had become a little darker, a little colder, a little less magical. The Red Priests mourned the dragons' passing, but also pointed out that they had fulfilled their purpose, had helped defeat the darkness, and that R'hllor would provide what was needed when the next crisis came, whether that took the form of more dragons or of something else entirely. The faith's emphasis on the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between fire and ice, between life and death, provided a framework that many people found helpful, even if they did not accept the theology in its entirety. The world is difficult, full of suffering and loss and threats that seem overwhelming, and having a story that explains this difficulty, that gives it meaning and purpose, that suggests the struggle matters in some cosmic sense. This is valuable regardless of whether the story is literally true. The Red Priests offered such a story, and many people adopted it, or at least borrowed from it, used its language and concepts to make sense of their own experiences of fighting against darkness in whatever form that darkness took. This metaphorical use of the faith's framework was perhaps not what the Red Priest intended, but and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the faith does not need to have all its theological questions resolved, does not need everyone to agree on what is literally true versus metaphorically meaningful. Perhaps what matters is that it motivates people to act against darkness, to choose life over death, to maintain hope even in the face of overwhelming threat, to believe that the light will ultimately prevail even when the night seems long and full of terrors. If the faith accomplishes these things, if it makes people better, braver, more capable of standing against the cold and the dark, then perhaps it is true enough, real enough, worthy of devotion, even if the ultimate metaphysical questions remain forever in the realm of mystery where fire flickers between light and shadow, between what is and what might be, between certainty and doubt. We have journeyed together through fire and shadow, through questions of faith and power, through the stories of those who believed and those who doubted, through resurrections and sacrifices and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. It has been a long exploration, this contemplation of the God who brings back the dead, of the priests who served him and the people whose lives were changed by encountering his power. You have stayed with me through all of it, through the complexity and the uncertainty, through the miracles and the horrors, and I am grateful for your companionship on this journey, through the mysteries of R'hllor. Let the questions rest now. Let the theological debates and the moral complexities fade like smoke dispersing in still air. You need not resolve what we have explored, need not decide what is real and what is interpretation, need not judge the priests or their choices. These are stories, after all, tales told by firelight about a world that never was, but that feels true nonetheless, that speaks to something in us about faith and doubt, about certainty and humility, about the eternal human struggle to find meaning in darkness. Feel yourself settling deeper now, your breath slowing to match the gentle rhythm of waves against a distant shore. The fires we have spoken of burn low, embers glowing soft and warm, casting dancing shadows that are no longer frightening but comforting, familiar, like old friends keeping watch while you rest. Somewhere in the world we have been exploring, the red priests are speaking their evening prayers, their voices a murmur of ancient words in a language older than memory. For the night is dark, yes, but you are safe here, warm here, held by the quiet and the stillness. The God who brings back the dead, whether real or imagined, whether divine being or human hope made manifest, has given us what gods are meant to give. Not answers, perhaps, but questions worth asking. Not certainty, but the courage to face uncertainty. Not an ending, but the strength to continue through darkness toward whatever light may come. And that is enough. That is more than enough. Let it all drift away now. The names and the battles, the prophecies and the burnings, the resurrections and the deaths. Let them become dreams, memories of stories someone once told you, fading like stars as dawn approaches. Your breathing is slow and deep, your body heavy and relaxed, your mind quiet as a winter snow falling on an empty field. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember, no questions that require answers tonight. The fires burn low and soft. The watch continues, as it always has, as it always will. But your watch is ending now, your vigil complete. Someone else will tend the flames through the dark hours. Someone else will keep the light burning. For now, for tonight, you may rest. The night is dark, yes, and full of terrors perhaps, but also full of stars, full of quiet, full of peace. Sleep now, gentle traveller. Let the fire fade to embers, to darkness, to the deep and dreamless rest that comes when all struggles cease and all questions fall silent. And now your watch has ended. Good night.